I was watching my favorite documentary when my daughter-in-law walked into my living room, snatched the remote right out of my hand, and shut the television off. "Enough of this trash," she said. "In this house, we watch smart things." My own son just stood there staring at his phone and nodded along. I did not yell or argue. I quietly went to the bank. The next day when they got home from work, they found themselves locked out, pounding on the door and screaming nonstop. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe disrespect always comes with a heavy price. My name is Byron. I am 68 years old and a retired chief civil engineer. The ceramic shattered across the kitchen tiles with a sharp, deafening crack. I froze with a paper coffee filter full of dark roast halfway to the machine. Megan brushed past me. She held a massive stainless steel espresso machine against her hip. She had just swiped my late wife Evelyn's favorite mug right off the granite counter. The bright yellow glaze exploded into dozens of jagged fragments across the floor. The handle snapped clean off and spun under the refrigerator. I stood there looking at the mess. I carefully set the coffee filter down on the counter. The kitchen was perfectly quiet except for the heavy thud of Megan slamming her new espresso machine onto the exact spot where the mug had rested for over a decade. She plugged the heavy black cord into the outlet and started pressing buttons. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not offer a single word of apology for destroying something so precious. She merely looked down at the bright yellow shards scattered around her expensive designer leather shoes and kicked a larger piece out of her way with the tip of her heel. Megan rolled her eyes and stepped over the debris. "It was just old junk anyway," she said without looking up from her machine. "We need actual counter space for my appliances. I cannot have this kitchen cluttered with garbage." I felt my chest tighten. That yellow mug was the exact cup Evelyn drank ginger tea from every morning during her grueling chemotherapy treatments. It was the vessel of her comfort during the hardest months of our lives. I washed it every single day for her, making sure the tea stains never set in. Jared walked into the kitchen right at that moment. He wore his perfectly tailored suit, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the reflection of the microwave. He looked down at the broken pieces of his own mother's cherished mug. He looked at me and then looked at his white wife. He did not reprimand her. He did not show an ounce of sorrow. "Let it go, Dad," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "It was just a cup." Megan needs her morning coffee before she heads to her consulting firm. You can easily buy another one at the dollar store. He stepped right on a piece of the yellow ceramic, crushing it further into the grout. I did not yell. I did not throw the coffee grounds at them. I slowly knelt on the hard floor and began picking up the pieces of Evelyn's mug one by one. The cold tile beneath my knees was laid by my own hands 30 years ago. I built this 4,000 square foot home using the bonuses from my first major bridge project. As a black man in a predominantly white engineering firm back in the 80s, I had to work 3 times as hard to earn those bonuses. Every calculation had to be flawless. Every late night spent poring over blueprints was done to secure a future for my family. I poured my blood and sweat into every brick and beam of this property. Jared inherited the absolute comfort of that privilege. He grew up with private tutors, summer camps, and a brand new car on his 16th birthday. He gained all the benefits of my grueling labor but inherited none of the grit. I picked up the final piece of the yellow handle. My son and his wife poured their fancy espresso and walked out of the kitchen laughing about their upcoming European vacation. I was left alone on the floor, collecting the fragments of the woman who gave Jared life. I stood up. I threw the sharp pieces of ceramic into the trash can and washed the ceramic dust from my rough hands. I dried my hands on a thick towel and walked out of the kitchen. I needed air. I headed down the main hallway toward the front door. As I passed the heavy oak console table near the entryway, something caught my eye. The heavy brass lock on my private filing cabinet tucked beneath the console was deeply scratched. I stopped and knelt in front of it. The metal was bent outward. Deep silver gouges surrounded the keyhole, indicating someone had taken a flathead screwdriver and brutally forced it open. The brass shavings still rested lightly on the polished wood floor, catching the morning light. This cabinet contained my most sensitive documents. As an engineer, I do not believe in accidents. I believe in structural failures. The destruction of Evelyn's mug was a structural failure of basic human decency, but the scratched brass lock was a calculated breach. I traced my thumb over the jagged gouges in the metal. The force required to pry this open meant they were desperate. They did not care about the noise or the damage. They only cared about the prize inside. I reached out and pulled the handle. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing a disorganized mess of papers that I always kept perfectly filed. Someone had violated my private space. I sifted through the thick manila folders. The life insurance policies were untouched. The medical records were shoved carelessly to the back. But the heavy folder containing the original property deed and the financial statements for the house was sitting right on top. The metal clasp was undone. My tax returns from the last 5 years had been pulled from their sleeves and shoved back improperly. The edges of the paper were crinkled. Megan always had a habit of folding the corners of pages when she read. I found 3 dog-eared pages inside my property tax file. She was analyzing the equity. She was looking at the assessed value of my home, the home I built. They were hunting for leverage. I closed the drawer and stood up in the quiet hallway. The disrespect in the kitchen was just a distraction. The real attack had happened right here in the shadows while I was asleep. They viewed me as a declining asset living in a house they believed was rightfully theirs. I walked back to my bedroom and reached for my phone. It was time to start digging. I was watching my favorite documentary when my daughter-in-law marched into my living room, snatched the remote right out of my hand, and shut the television off entirely. "Enough of this trash," she declared. "In this house, we watch smart things." My own son simply sat there staring at his phone and nodded along. I did not yell. I did not argue. I quietly walked upstairs to my hidden floor safe. The next day when they returned from work, they found themselves completely locked out, pounding their fists against the heavy oak door and screaming nonstop. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe extreme disrespect always comes with a heavy price. My name is Byron. I am 68 years old and a retired chief civil engineer. Evening arrived with a heavy, uncomfortable tension settling over the house. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair watching a detailed documentary about the architectural triumphs of modern civil infrastructure. Megan marched straight across the Persian rug, snatched the television remote right out of my hand, and shut the screen off entirely. The sudden silence in the room was jarring. I looked up, my fingers still curled around the empty air where the device had been just a second prior. Megan stood over me with her hands resting firmly on her hips, her posture radiating an entirely unwarranted authority. The large screen faded to black perfectly, reflecting the absolute coldness in her eyes. I had spent 12 hours that day organizing the heavy tools in the garage, paying the monthly utility bills from my own pocket, and maintaining the landscaping of the sprawling property I owned. The evening was strictly supposed to be my dedicated time of quiet reflection. Instead, I found myself staring up at a 29-year-old woman who treated my private living space like her personal kingdom. Jared walked into the room a moment later holding a tall glass of imported sparkling water. He took a comfortable seat on the sofa, perfectly at ease with the blatant disrespect playing out right in front of him. He did not issue a single reprimand to his wife. He simply stared down at his phone, swiping through his social media feeds as if I were entirely invisible. The disrespect was no longer a subtle undercurrent in our daily interactions. It was loud, it was proud, and it was fully endorsed by the boy I had raised with every ounce of my strength. "Enough of this trash," Megan said. She tossed the remote onto the glass coffee table with a loud clatter. "In this house, we watch smart things." The audacity of her statement hung heavily in the air. She used the phrase "this house" as if her name was anywhere on the mortgage, as if she had driven a single nail into these walls or poured a single ounce of concrete for the foundation. I turned my gaze directly to Jared, waiting patiently for the son I raised to step in and correct his wife's completely unacceptable behavior. Jared finally looked up from his glowing screen. He swirled the water in his glass, actively avoiding direct eye contact with me. He looked at the blank television and then sighed heavily, acting as if my very existence was an exhausting burden to bear. "You should probably just go to sleep anyway, Dad," he said. His voice was entirely dismissive, carrying a rehearsed tone of false concern that made my stomach turn. "Your mind is getting slow lately. You barely remember what you watch anyway. You need your rest." The sheer absolute disrespect felt like a physical blow directly to my chest. He was actively gaslighting me right in the middle of my own living room. He was deliberately laying the groundwork for a toxic narrative they were actively constructing. A narrative where I was a frail, confused old man completely incapable of managing his own life and decisions. They were violently testing my boundaries, prodding the defensive fence to see if the electric current was still active. I looked at the two of them sitting on my sofa, drinking my water, breathing the air conditioned by the expensive unit I paid to repair just last week. I did not yell. I did not demand the remote back. I did not waste my breath explaining that my cognitive functions were sharper and more resilient than both of theirs combined. I simply stood up in absolute silence. My silence was not an act of surrender. My silence was a calculated tactical retreat. Decades of managing massive civil engineering projects and directing hundreds of workers had taught me one undeniable truth. You never argue with a reckless wrecking ball. You step back, assess the structural integrity of your foundation, and prepare a highly reinforced countermeasure. I turned my back on them and walked steadily toward the staircase. I could feel their smug satisfaction radiating behind me like a foul odor. They truly believed they had won a significant victory over a helpless senior citizen. They entirely mistook my measured discipline for the weakness of old age. I climbed the wooden stairs, my footsteps steady and deliberate against the hardwood. I walked straight into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale streetlights filtering through the window blinds. I intentionally bypassed the filing cabinet located under the console table. The scratched brass lock I had discovered earlier that morning was just a clumsy distraction. It was a decoy for a much larger, more devastating breach. I moved the heavy leather armchair aside with ease. I peeled back the edge of the tightly woven carpet and removed the loose baseboard positioned against the far wall. Behind the drywall sat a hidden state-of-the-art fireproof floor safe. I installed it 20 years ago to protect my most vital documents from any potential disaster. I knelt on the floor and quickly inputted the 6-digit numerical code. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open with a smooth, silent glide. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, fire-resistant folder holding my absolute most critical financial assets. I flipped past the birth certificates, the old tax returns, and the offshore retirement account statements that Jared knew absolutely nothing about. My fingers searched specifically for the heavy, textured parchment of the original property deed. I found a document in the correct sleeve and pulled it out into the dim light of the room. At first glance, it looked perfectly normal and entirely official, but my hands immediately recognized the structural discrepancy. The paperweight was completely wrong. It felt thin, cheap, and entirely lacking the rigid cotton-pressed density of an authentic municipal land deed. I turned on my desk lamp and held the document directly up to the bright bulb. The mandatory security watermark was completely missing. The embossed county seal was entirely flat, revealing itself as a high-quality color photocopy printed on premium resume paper, but a fake nonetheless. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The scratched filing cabinet downstairs was deliberately meant to make me think they had failed to find anything valuable. But they had actually found my secondary combination journal hidden among old blueprints. They had breached my hidden safe, stolen the actual legally binding property deed to my home, and replaced it with a worthless counterfeit. They were not just disrespecting me with childish insults downstairs. They were actively and aggressively dismantling my entire life to steal my hard-earned legacy right out from under me. The missing deed was the ultimate confirmation. The war for my survival had officially begun. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank downtown. The morning air was crisp, but my focus remained razor-sharp. I bypassed the standard teller line where people waited patiently with their daily deposits. I walked directly to the branch manager's private office. A young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a silver name tag reading Mr. Hayes sat behind a polished mahogany desk. He looked up with a polite corporate smile that quickly faded when he saw my rigid expression. I did not offer a polite morning greeting. I sat heavily in the leather chair opposite him and placed my state-issued driver license flat on his desk. I demanded a complete and immediate audit of my primary residence property equity. Mr. Hayes blinked in sheer surprise, but my tone left absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. I built my career managing multi-million-dollar municipal budgets, overseeing massive concrete projects, and dealing with stubborn contractors. I know exactly how to command a room with absolute authority. He typed my information into his computer terminal. The clicking of his keyboard filled the quiet office space. He asked a few mandatory security questions to verify my identity. I answered them with rapid, unyielding precision. I needed to know exactly what kind of financial structural damage had been done to my home while I slept under my own roof. The stolen deed from my floor safe was not a mere prank. It was a calculated breach of my financial foundation. Mr. Hayes finished typing and pulled up my main account profile. His brow furrowed slightly as he scanned the data on the screen. He adjusted his glasses and looked back at me with a professional but clearly confused expression. I leaned forward in the leather chair, resting my hands firmly on the edge of his desk. The silent tension in the room thickened into something heavy. I ordered him to read the numbers aloud. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably and informed me that my property currently carried a massive home equity line of credit totaling $150,000. He stated the funds had been fully drawn exactly 3 months ago. I stared at the glowing monitor behind him without blinking. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I paid off the mortgage on that 4,000 square foot house 15 years ago with my own sweat and discipline. I never once applied for a home equity line of credit. I maintained a strict zero-debt lifestyle by careful design. Mr. Hayes turned the monitor toward me to display the digital bank records. He pointed a shaking finger to a highlighted row showing a massive lump sum transfer initiated right at the start of the fiscal quarter. I felt a cold surge of absolute clarity wash over my entire body. Exactly 3 months ago, Jared had generously offered to help me organize my tax documents, claiming he wanted to save me the terrible hassle of dealing with the annual paperwork. I had trusted my flesh and blood and handed him a stack of utility bills and property tax assessments. He had used that exact window of opportunity to gather the necessary data to weaponize my home equity. He weaponized my trust to secure a massive loan against the very walls I built to shelter him as a child. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic to the bank manager. Panic is the ultimate enemy of strategy. Instead, I calmly asked him to pull up the original digital authorization forms used to approve the credit line. Mr. Hayes hesitated, mentioning strict bank policy regarding fraud investigations. I firmly reminded him that I am the sole legal owner of the property, and I demanded to see the origination documents immediately. He complied with a nervous nod. The scanned authorization form appeared on the high-definition monitor. Mr. Hayes zoomed in directly on the final page containing the applicant's signature line. I leaned much closer to the screen. The signature staring back at me looked incredibly accurate at first glance. The capital letters perfectly matched my general handwriting, and the slant was almost identical. It was a true masterpiece of mimicry. But my son missed one crucial, highly specific detail. During my 40 years as a chief civil engineer signing off on massive municipal bridge blueprints, I developed a very specific habit. I always left a microscopic break at the top loop of the letter B in my name. It was an intentional structural flaw I created to differentiate my final approval from preliminary drafts. The signature on the bank form had a perfectly closed loop. It was a seamless, unbroken circle drawn by someone who had traced my signature from a standard tax return without truly understanding the mechanics behind it. Jared forged it. My own son sat at my dining room table, drank my coffee, and meticulously practiced stealing my identity until he perfected the counterfeit. He possessed the sheer audacity to legally bind me to a massive debt simply to fund his lifestyle. I instructed Mr. Hayes to print a high-quality physical copy of that exact document. He hit the print button and the heavy machine hummed to life. I took the warm paper from the output tray. This was no longer just a familial dispute over a broken ceramic mug or a stolen television remote. This was documented federal bank fraud carrying severe mandatory prison sentences. I folded the paper sharply and placed it securely into my inner jacket pocket. I turned back to Mr. Hayes and asked him to trace the exact destination of the withdrawn funds. If the money was gone, I needed to know exactly whose pockets were lined with my hard-earned equity. The manager hesitated again, citing strict privacy laws regarding external bank accounts. I stood up from the chair and projected my full height over his desk. I informed him that I was the direct victim of a 6-figure financial crime perpetrated through his specific branch, and he would either provide the routing information now or explain his negligence to federal investigators by noon. The manager swallowed hard and typed rapidly on his keyboard. He pulled up the wire transfer history tied to the credit line. He pointed to a recurring automated withdrawal set up to drain the equity in regular monthly intervals. He accidentally revealed the registered name of the receiving corporate account. The screen clearly displayed the title, Megan Consulting Group, LLC. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. My daughter-in-law was not just a complicit bystander in this theft. She was the primary financial beneficiary. They were laundering my stolen equity directly into a corporate shell company registered exclusively under her name. The expensive designer shoes, the brand new espresso machine, the lavish European vacation plans, All of it was funded by the unauthorized mortgage on my home. They were actively bleeding me dry right in front of my face. I thanked the pale bank manager for his time and walked out of the office. The bright morning sun hit my face as I stepped onto the pavement. My phone was already in my hand. I dialed Mitchell's direct office line. The time for silent observation was officially over. I drove straight to the industrial outskirts of the city where the neon sign of a chrome diner flickered against the mid-morning sky. I walked inside and immediately spotted Mitchell sitting in a back booth. Mitchell is a ruthless corporate attorney who spent his entire career dismantling fraudulent enterprises for high-profile clients. He is also my oldest friend. We stood shoulder to shoulder during the civil rights protests of our youth, and we spent decades building our respective careers from the ground up. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the cracked vinyl of the diner booth. I sat down across from him and did not bother with pleasantries. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the freshly printed bank documents. I slid the thick stack of papers across the sticky Formica table. Mitchell picked up his black reading glasses and reviewed the top page. His eyes narrowed instantly as he analyzed the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I watched his jaw tighten. He recognized the forged signature immediately. Mitchell knows my meticulous handwriting just as well as I do because he reviewed hundreds of my municipal contract approvals over the years. I tapped my index finger against the paper and told him exactly what the bank manager had accidentally revealed. The stolen equity was actively being funneled into an external corporate account registered under the name Megan Consulting Group, LLC. Mitchell did not ask any useless questions about how I felt. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out his encrypted laptop. He flipped the screen open and connected to his private legal database. The time for sentimentality had officially expired. We had a financial structure to tear down. Mitchell accessed the state corporate registry with a few rapid keystrokes. The database populated a detailed profile of the company. Megan Consulting Group was nothing more than a hollow ghost entity. It had 0 listed employees, absolutely no registered physical office space, and 0 reported commercial operations. It was a classic shell company designed specifically to launder misappropriated assets. Mitchell hacked deeper into the financial routing trails connected to the corporate registry. The digital footprint exposed exactly where my hard-earned home equity was flowing. Massive sums of cash were being aggressively diverted into highly volatile cryptocurrency exchanges entirely registered under Jared's personal name. My son was desperately trying to cover catastrophic trading losses using the financial stability I spent 40 years building. Whatever remained of the stolen funds was being aggressively funneled into Megan's lavish lifestyle choices. Mitchell pulled up recent transaction receipts tied to the corporate account. The list included first-class plane tickets to Europe, 5-star luxury hotel reservations, and exorbitant purchases at high-end designer boutiques. They were systematically bleeding my property completely dry. Every time Megan swiped her corporate card to buy a new designer handbag, she was literally selling off another square foot of the foundation I laid with my own bare hands. The absolute arrogance of their operation was staggering. They felt entirely invincible. They assumed an aging black man who spent his evenings watching television in a worn leather armchair would simply never notice the sophisticated financial extraction happening right beneath his nose. Mitchell looked up from his glowing screen. His expression was cold and thoroughly calculating. He stated clearly that they were pulling maximum capital out of the house as rapidly as the bank allowed. The aggressive withdrawal rate indicated they were racing against a very specific timeline. We sat in the quiet diner booth and mapped out their exact endgame with clinical precision. It was a brutally efficient extraction strategy. By continuously pulling the maximum allowable funds through the fraudulent equity line, they were intentionally setting the house up for inevitable financial ruin. Once they drained the absolute last available dollar, they would simply stop making the minimum monthly payments on the loan. The bank would issue warnings and eventually launch a rapid foreclosure process to seize the property. Jared and Megan had absolutely no intention of keeping the house or maintaining my legacy. Their entire operation relied on abandoning the heavily indebted asset right before the bank executed the seizure. We analyzed the terrifying final phase of their blueprint. When the foreclosure inevitably went through, I would be left completely homeless and stripped of all financial independence. They needed a place to discard me so they could walk away with the laundered cash perfectly clean. They planned to dump me in an underfunded state-run nursing facility. They would comfortably label me a tragic victim of natural cognitive decline who mismanaged his own retirement funds. They would play the role of deeply concerned children who simply lacked the resources to support a failing parent. The sheer ruthlessness of their plan mirrored the very worst corporate takedowns Mitchell and I had witnessed during our careers. They were orchestrating my total erasure from society just to fund an artificial luxury lifestyle and cover their reckless gambling debts. I drank my black coffee. The bitter liquid matched the absolute coldness spreading through my chest. I instructed Mitchell to begin preparing the legal countermeasures immediately. We needed to fortify my assets and construct an impenetrable barrier before they finalized their exit strategy. Mitchell nodded and minimized the corporate registry window on his laptop. He opened the highly secure county court portal to check if Jared had initiated any formal legal maneuvers to secure their position. The screen loaded a massive directory of recent judicial filings. Mitchell typed my full legal name into the search bar and hit the enter key. The system instantly returned a single active hit. The timestamp showed the document had been officially submitted to the court clerk just yesterday afternoon. Mitchell opened the attached digital file and began reading the legal summary aloud. The air in the diner completely stalled in my lungs. Jared had formally filed a petition seeking immediate and full power of attorney over my entire estate. In the sworn affidavit, my own son explicitly claimed that I was currently suffering from severe and rapidly advancing cognitive decline. He legally asserted that I was entirely incapable of managing my physical health or making sound financial decisions. He cited my supposed memory lapses and fabricated instances of erratic behavior to justify his request for total legal control over my life. The petition included a request for an emergency hearing to expedite the transfer of authority. If a judge approved this filing, Jared would gain the absolute legal right to sign away my home, liquidate my remaining bank accounts, and forcibly commit me to any medical facility of his choosing without my consent. The forged bank loan was merely their funding mechanism. This court petition was the actual weapon they intended to use to execute me. I looked at the digital legal document bearing my son's name. The blueprint of my destruction was perfectly laid out. They were accelerating their timeline. I told Mitchell to close his laptop. It was time to go home and play my part. I drove back from the diner with absolute clarity. The engine of my car hummed a steady rhythm against the asphalt. I parked in the driveway and walked up the front steps of my home. The heavy oak door unlocked with a solid click. I stepped into the foyer and immediately smelled roasted garlic and seared prime rib. I walked into the kitchen. Megan stood by the granite island pouring a deep red vintage into 2 large crystal glasses. I recognized the label from a high-end vineyard. The bottle cost more than a standard weekly grocery bill. She was literally drinking the equity of my house. Jared sat on a bar stool actively scrolling through travel itineraries on his tablet. He wore a brand new designer sweater. He did not look up when I entered the room. He simply raised his voice to ensure I heard his bragging. He excitedly announced that they had just finalized booking a 2-week luxury vacation to Europe for next month. He detailed the first-class flights and the 5-star hotels overlooking the Mediterranean. He described private tours and exclusive dining reservations. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man spending phantom wealth. I stood in the doorway observing the sheer scale of their financial delusion. Every thread of that designer sweater and every drop of that imported wine was paid for by the forged signature on my home equity line of credit. I placed my keys on the counter and took my seat at the dining table. I did not confront them. I did not mention the bank or the court petition. I maintained my perfectly neutral expression and prepared to deliver the exact performance they desperately needed to see. Jared carried his plate to the table and sat directly across from me. He cut into his prime rib with expensive silver cutlery. He paused and pointed his fork at me with a completely manufactured look of concern. He asked in a slow, exaggerated tone if I had remembered to take my memory pills today. He spoke to me with the precise cadence an adult uses when addressing a slow toddler. He enunciated every single syllable as if my auditory processing was completely compromised. Megan walked over carrying her crystal wine glass and sat beside him. She placed a glossy tri-fold pamphlet directly onto the center of the table. She smiled a sharp, predatory smile and slid the heavy paper across the polished wood until it rested against my dinner plate. The cover featured smiling seniors sitting in wheelchairs on a manicured lawn. She tapped the glossy image with her manicured fingernail. She called the facility a premium vacation resort for seniors. She adopted a sickeningly sweet voice, claiming the house was simply becoming too large and dangerous for me to navigate alone. She insisted I needed 24-hour professional supervision for my own safety. Jared nodded enthusiastically and chimed in right on cue. He stated they were only looking out for my best interests because my cognitive decline was becoming entirely impossible to ignore. They were actively building their verbal alibi right in front of me. They were using this dinner to reinforce the exact false narrative Jared had submitted to the county court portal just 24 hours prior. They genuinely believed their gaslighting was breaking down my mental defenses. They needed me compliant and confused to ensure the power of attorney transfer went through without a single legal challenge. I knew exactly what my structural role in this interaction required. I needed to validate their absolute worst assumptions. I needed to feed their arrogance. I needed them completely blind to my actual countermeasures. I picked up my heavy silver fork. I held it loosely in my right hand, hovering over my plate. I allowed my fingers to tremble visibly. I intentionally relaxed my grip and let the solid metal fork drop directly onto the ceramic plate. It landed with a loud, sharp clatter. I did not reach down to pick it up. I let my jaw go slack and stared completely blankly at the blank wall behind Jared. I held my breath to slow my chest movements, projecting the physical appearance of a vacant, absent mind. The dining room fell completely silent. I slowly turned my head toward Megan. I blinked twice, allowing my eyes to lose their sharp focus. I looked directly at her smug face and called her by my late wife's name. I asked Evelyn why the kitchen felt so cold. The reaction was instantaneous and deeply sickening. Jared and Megan exchanged a rapid look of pure, absolute triumph. Megan covered her mouth to hide a vicious, delighted smirk. Jared leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, radiating the absolute satisfaction of a predator watching its prey finally collapse. The sheer joy on their faces confirmed the true depth of their malicious intent. They were thrilled by my supposed mental deterioration. They viewed my feigned vulnerability as their ultimate victory. They truly thought they had won the war. They believed the path to my total financial ruin was now completely clear of any resistance. I maintained my vacant stare while my mind calculated the exact angle of their destruction. Dinner concluded with Jared and Megan speaking over me as if I were a deaf ghost. They left their dirty plates on the table and retreated to the living room to watch a movie. I slowly gathered the dishes and carried them to the kitchen sink. I turned on the warm water and began scrubbing the plates, letting the rhythmic sound of the running faucet mask my movements. I reached into my deep trouser pocket and pulled out a small black digital audio recorder. I kept this highly sensitive piece of equipment from my active engineering days when I needed to dictate hands-free structural assessments on noisy construction sites. It possessed a highly advanced omnidirectional microphone capable of capturing a whisper from 30 feet away. I knelt down as if to retrieve dish soap from the lower cabinet. I swiftly planted the tiny magnetic device directly under the overhanging lip of the granite kitchen island. It attached silently to the metal support bracket, completely invisible from any standing angle. I pushed a miniature wireless earpiece deep into my left ear and activated the receiver. The audio feed was crystal clear. I immediately heard the sound of a phone dialing from the living room. Megan was making a completely unprotected phone call. I scrubbed a pan and listened intently as she connected with a local real estate agent. Her voice was sharp and entirely stripped of her previous fake sweetness. She confidently informed the agent that the power of attorney paperwork was being expedited by a judge. She instructed the realtor to begin preparing the aggressive marketing materials immediately. She promised the agent they could officially list my house on the open market in exactly 3 weeks. The countdown to my eviction was set. The sun broke through the kitchen blinds, casting sharp angles of light across the granite island where I had planted the recorder the night before. I stood by the coffee maker watching the dark liquid fill my simple ceramic mug. Upstairs, the heavy thud of footsteps signaled the beginning of the morning rush. Jared and Megan moved through the house with the loud, entitled energy of people who believed they owned the very floorboards they walked on. I sat at the small breakfast table and sipped my coffee in total silence. Megan came down first, dressed in a sharply tailored designer suit that reeked of my stolen home equity. She did not even acknowledge my presence. She grabbed her travel mug and marched out the front door. Jared followed a few minutes later, holding his expensive leather briefcase. He paused by the table and offered a painfully patronizing smile. He told me to make sure I did not wander outside and get lost today. He promised he would bring home some pudding for me after work. I gave him a slow, vacant nod, playing the exact pathetic role he had written for me. He walked out and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The moment their tires pulled out of the driveway, my entire demeanor shifted. The vacant stare vanished. I rinsed my mug, placed it gently in the sink, and grabbed my keys. I walked out to my meticulously maintained sedan and started the engine. The drive to the First National Bank took exactly 14 minutes. I did not listen to the radio. My mind was completely focused on the precise mathematical execution of my counterattack. I walked back into the private office of Mr. Hayes, the branch manager. He looked up from his computer monitor, clearly nervous to see me return so soon. I sat down and placed my identification directly on the center of his polished desk. I instructed him to open a direct channel to my offshore financial institution. Jared possessed a dangerously incomplete understanding of my financial architecture. He genuinely believed that my entire survival relied solely on a modest monthly municipal pension and the physical equity of this house. He calculated his entire hostile takeover based on that deeply flawed assumption. He never bothered to look past the surface. Decades ago, during the peak of my civil engineering career, I developed and successfully patented two highly specialized structural reinforcement mechanisms used in commercial bridge construction. 10 years ago, a major international conglomerate purchased the exclusive rights to those patents. I routed the massive payout directly into a high-yield, secure offshore trust fund. I purposefully kept this wealth entirely invisible. I never upgraded my reliable sedan. I never flaunted designer clothing. I allowed my son to believe I was living on a fixed income to test his character and protect my assets from his reckless financial habits. I currently possess more liquid cash accumulating interest in that single secure account than Jared will ever legitimately earn in his entire lifetime. Mr. Hayes finished verifying the routing numbers and looked at me for the final authorization. I gave him a single sharp nod. I was about to deploy a microscopic fraction of my actual wealth to absolutely crush their entire parasitic operation. I authorized the immediate wire transfer of $150,000 to clear the outstanding balance of the fraudulent home equity line of credit. Mr. Hayes typed the commands with a cautious urgency. The system processed the massive influx of cash, instantly wiping out the six-figure debt Jared had illegally anchored to my property. I did not stop there. I ordered the bank manager to permanently terminate the line of credit and officially seal the account. I watched his screen as the digital status changed from active to completely closed. The primary financial artery feeding their luxury lifestyle was successfully severed. I then instructed Mr. Hayes to implement a maximum security freeze on all my personal profiles. I demanded the revocation of every single secondary access point, authorized user, and linked debit card associated with my identity. Any financial instrument tied to my name or my property address was instantly neutralized. Jared had used forged documents to build a digital bridge into my vault. I was now detonating that bridge while they were still standing directly in the middle of it. Mr. Hayes printed out the confirmation receipts and handed them to me. The paper felt heavy and deeply satisfying in my hands. The bank manager assured me that the security protocols were active and absolutely no funds could move without my physical presence and biometric verification. I thanked him for his prompt cooperation and folded the receipts into my breast pocket. My home was financially fortified, the trap was set, and the vault was permanently locked. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank and stepped out into the bright mid-morning sunlight. The crisp air felt incredibly refreshing, filling my lungs with the pure oxygen of reclaimed control. I walked steadily toward my parked sedan, feeling a profound sense of structural stability return to my life. As I reached for the door handle, my mobile phone vibrated sharply against my thigh. I pulled the device from my pocket and looked at the illuminated screen. It was an automated security alert generated by the strict financial monitoring parameters I had just established with Mr. Hayes. The notification text was crisp and strictly transactional. A secondary corporate credit card issued to Megan Consulting Group, explicitly tied to the now terminated home equity line, had just attempted a massive transaction. Megan was currently standing inside an exclusive high-end designer boutique, attempting to purchase over $4,000 worth of luxury merchandise. The notification glowed brightly with a single beautiful word in bold red letters: declined. I stood by my car and stared at the notification, reading it a second time just to savor the absolute finality of the transaction status. I could easily picture the scene unfolding miles away. The embarrassed retail clerk holding the useless plastic card. Megan staring in absolute shock as the machine rejected her stolen wealth. The sudden humiliating realization that her unlimited access to my hard-earned legacy had vanished without a single warning. I slid the phone back into my pocket and unlocked my car door. The illusion of their victory was officially over. The financial strike had landed perfectly. The absolute chaos was about to begin. I drove straight from the bank to the financial district. I did not stop for lunch. I did not pause to catch my breath. I walked directly into the high-rise glass building and rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. I pushed through the heavy double doors of Mitchell's law firm. His receptionist did not ask me to wait. She recognized the absolute rigid focus in my eyes and immediately buzzed me through to his private corner office. I walked directly into Mitchell's office without knocking. The room smelled of old paper, expensive coffee, and polished wood. Mitchell sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply pointed to a thick stack of legal documents waiting precisely in the center of his desk. The papers were aligned with absolute geometric perfection. I stood in front of the desk and looked down at the physical manifestation of my counteroffensive. Mitchell folded his hands together and leaned back in his leather chair. He had spent the entire morning drafting the exact legal architecture required to permanently dismantle my son's hostile takeover. The digital strike at the bank was only the initial phase. The bank maneuvers severed their financial supply line. The documents sitting on the mahogany desk were designed to obliterate their legal standing entirely. I took a seat across from my oldest friend. I pulled a silver pen from my inside jacket pocket. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. I was a man preparing to sign a declaration of war against his own flesh and blood. I clicked the pen. I clicked the pen again. I looked at Mitchell. I told him to explain the defensive structure. Mitchell leaned forward and rested his elbows on the mahogany wood. He explained the exact mechanism required to absolutely crush Jared's pending power of attorney petition. Jared submitted a legal claim asserting I was mentally compromised and incapable of managing my own assets. He wanted the county court to hand him the keys to my entire estate. He wanted the keys to my house. He wanted the keys to my life. To entirely neutralize that attack, I needed to remove the estate from the equation completely. I needed to remove myself as the primary target. Mitchell slid the first document across the desk. It was the formal creation of an irrevocable trust. By signing this document, I was legally and permanently transferring the total ownership of my home, my offshore accounts, and all my liquid assets directly into the trust. I would name a neutral, unassailable third-party corporate fiduciary as the primary trustee. I would officially own absolutely nothing on paper. I would be legally stripped of all personal property. I would be a man with zero assets to manage. The logic was cold. The logic was brilliant. The logic was absolutely bulletproof. Jared could not legally petition to manage assets that I no longer owned. Jared could not seize control of a house that belonged to an impenetrable corporate trust. Jared could not steal what I legally no longer possessed. I picked up the silver pen. I pressed the ink to the heavy paper. I signed my name with absolute precision, ensuring the microscopic break in the loop of the letter B was perfectly visible. I signed the next page. I signed the page after that. I signed away the house I built. I signed away the wealth I accumulated. I signed away my material legacy to protect it from the greed of my only son. I pushed the finalized trust documents back across the mahogany desk. Mitchell stamped them with his official notary seal. The defensive perimeter was officially established. Now it was time to launch the offensive strike. Mitchell opened his encrypted laptop and pulled up a secondary document. He had drafted this specific file while I was busy severing the home equity line at the bank. He turned the screen toward me so I could read the bold, uncompromising text. It was a formal eviction notice. It was not a standard 30-day warning. It was a hostile, immediate removal order explicitly naming Jared and Megan as perpetrators of ongoing financial fraud and elder abuse. Mitchell detailed the exact statutes they had violated by forging my signature on the bank loan and secretly diverting the funds into a corporate shell company. He legally classified their continued presence in my home as a direct active threat to my personal and financial safety. The document demanded their absolute and immediate expulsion from the property. Mitchell printed the eviction notice on heavy, formal legal letterhead. He handed me the crisp pages. The ink was still warm from the printer. I read the words detailing my son's betrayal. I read the words labeling my daughter-in-law as an active financial predator. I felt the absolute weight of the paper in my hands. I felt the weight of the betrayal. I felt the weight of the consequence. I felt the weight of a father actively dismantling his child's entire life. I looked at Mitchell. I asked him how quickly we could execute the absolute removal. He took the document from my hands, placed it into a red emergency filing folder, and stood up from his chair. He told me we were going directly to the county courthouse to bypass the standard administrative delays. We walked into the county courthouse exactly 40 minutes later. Mitchell utilized his decades of cultivated legal connections to completely bypass the crowded clerk's office. He walked us directly into the private chambers of a senior presiding judge he had known for 20 years. The judge reviewed the massive stack of irrefutable evidence. He reviewed the forged bank authorization form. He reviewed the digital tracking of the stolen equity flowing into Megan's shell company. He reviewed the audio transcript of my son plotting my forced commitment to a state-run facility. The judge did not ask any clarifying questions. The fraud was undeniably documented. The elder abuse was mathematically proven. The absolute betrayal was recorded in black and white. The judge picked up his heavy judicial pen and signed the emergency eviction order without a single moment of hesitation. The ink dried instantly, sealing their fate. Mitchell handed me the certified, judge-signed copy as we walked out of the heavy brass doors of the courthouse. The emergency order granted me the absolute legal authority to remove Jared and Megan from my property, effective immediately. The local police department was now legally mandated to enforce their permanent expulsion if they resisted. I stood on the concrete steps of the courthouse holding the certified document. I looked down at the official court seal stamped in blue ink. The legal foundation of their destruction was now perfectly complete. The financial pipeline was severed. The property was shielded. The eviction was authorized. I looked at my watch. It was barely past noon. Jared and Megan were still sitting in their respective offices, completely oblivious to the catastrophic storm about to obliterate their artificial reality. I thanked Mitchell for his flawless execution. I walked to my car and started the engine. I just needed to prepare the house for their permanent exit. I drove back to my property under the fading light of the late afternoon. The house stood perfectly still against the approaching dusk. I parked my sedan in the garage and walked through the side door. I made myself a simple dinner and retreated upstairs to my master bedroom long before the sun completely set. I needed absolute isolation to monitor the incoming fallout. I locked the heavy oak door to my room and sat in the darkness. I placed the small wireless receiver on my nightstand and pushed the earpiece deeply into my left ear. The house remained silent for several hours. The digital clock glowing on my dresser shifted exactly to 9 at night. The heavy front door downstairs suddenly slammed open with enough force to rattle the window panes. Heavy, quick footsteps echoed fiercely against the hardwood floors of the foyer. A heavy designer leather purse crashed violently onto the granite surface of the kitchen island. Megan had finally returned from her humiliating retail excursion. Her voice pierced the quiet house like a shattered pane of glass. She screamed Jared's name with a raw, unhinged fury. She did not bother to take off her coat or lower her volume. She marched directly into the living room where Jared was likely sitting. She demanded immediate answers. She shrieked that she had stood at the checkout counter of a luxury boutique for 20 minutes, while the cashier repeatedly declined her premium card. She described the absolute embarrassment of leaving empty-handed while the store employees whispered behind her back. She demanded to know exactly what structural failure had occurred within their stolen financial pipeline. She commanded Jared to fix the problem this very second, or face the absolute destruction of their European vacation plans. The audio feed picked up the frantic tapping of Jared typing numbers into his mobile phone. I heard him pacing across the kitchen tiles directly beneath my bedroom floor. He dialed the 24-hour automated customer service line for the First National Bank. He punched in the fraudulent account numbers and the stolen access PIN. A robotic female voice echoed clearly through my earpiece. The automated system officially informed him that the home equity line of credit currently held a zero balance and was permanently closed to all future transactions. Jared dropped his phone onto the granite counter. He gasped loudly, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his absolute financial ruin crashed down on him in real time. Megan completely lost whatever fragile composure she had left. She began throwing things across the kitchen. A glass shattered against the stainless steel refrigerator. She cornered Jared verbally. She shrieked that they were entirely out of money. She demanded to know exactly how a supposedly senile old man managed to completely dismantle their carefully constructed corporate shell company in a single afternoon. She accused Jared of leaving a paper trail. She blamed him for being sloppy with the bank documents. She screamed that an aging engineer suffering from severe cognitive decline could not possibly navigate a complex financial freeze without being tipped off. She paced aggressively around the kitchen island, demanding an explanation for the sudden closure of the account. She reminded him that they had unpayable debts coming due in days. She viciously mocked his intelligence, stating that he was officially outsmarted by a man who could barely remember to turn off the television. She demanded to know exactly how the bank recognized the fraudulent application. I sat perfectly still in the absolute darkness of my locked bedroom. I did not turn on a single light. I kept my breathing shallow and slow to ensure absolute silence on my end of the floorboards. The tiny earpiece delivered every single syllable of their panic directly into my ear canal. I rested my hand on the digital recorder, watching the small red light pulse with every sound wave. Jared's voice finally broke through Megan's relentless screaming. He sounded weak and completely terrified. He admitted that the bank must have manually verified the primary signature on the original loan authorization form. Megan demanded to know why that mattered. She yelled that the signature looked completely identical to the ones on my previous tax returns. Jared began to hyperventilate. He openly confessed his exact methodology right into the hidden microphone. He admitted out loud that he had stolen an old municipal contract from my office files. He confessed that he spent 3 grueling weeks sitting at his desk tracing my exact handwriting over and over again until his hand cramped. He practiced the specific curvature of the letters to secure the $150,000 loan. He admitted he must have missed a crucial detail in the forgery that triggered the bank's internal fraud department. He cried out that he was facing federal charges if the bank decided to prosecute the fake application. The audio recording captured his full, uncooperative confession in pristine, high-definition sound. He freely admitted to the premeditated theft of my identity and the explicit intent to drain my home equity. He handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to absolutely bury him. My son voluntarily built his own prison cell with his own spoken words. Megan did not offer her husband an ounce of comfort. She did not express a single moment of regret for the massive crime they had jointly committed against me. She instantly pivoted to pure survival mode. She completely ignored his terror regarding the federal bank fraud. Her voice dropped into a low, sharp hiss that radiated pure malice. She walked directly up to him. I could hear the sharp click of her heels stopping right next to the microphone. She ordered Jared to completely abandon the pending legal petition for the power of attorney. She stated they no longer had the time to wait for a judge to rule on my cognitive decline. The legal route was entirely compromised now that the bank was aware of the structural discrepancies. She devised a new, brutally aggressive timeline. She instructed Jared to completely bypass the court system. She commanded him to wake up at 6 tomorrow morning and immediately dial emergency services. She ordered him to falsely report that I was experiencing a violent psychotic break. She wanted him to call an ambulance and have the paramedics forcibly remove me from the property under a psychiatric hold. She calculated that once I was locked inside a state-run medical facility, they could easily ransack the remaining valuables in the house and flee the state before the police connected the bank fraud to them. The sheer ruthlessness of her strategy was astounding. I reached out in the darkness and pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. The audio file processed and saved securely to the internal drive. I connected the device to my encrypted laptop. I attached the audio file to an urgent message and sent it directly to Mitchell's secure server. The morning sun breached the horizon and cast long, pale shadows across the hardwood floors of my home. The digital clock beside my bed displayed exactly 8 o'clock. Downstairs, the familiar sounds of rushed, frantic movement echoed through the ceiling. Jared and Megan were moving with a hyperactive urgency that completely betrayed their usual weekend lethargy. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, listening to the sharp click of Megan's heels pacing across the kitchen tiles. Jared called up the stairs with a strained, overly casual tone. He announced they had an important early morning errand to run downtown. He told me to stay put and rest because they would be back in a few hours to take me somewhere special. I did not bother to answer. I knew exactly where they were going. They were heading directly to the local medical administration building to arrange the emergency psychiatric transport. They intended to secure an ambulance and a crew of paramedics willing to forcibly remove a supposedly unhinged elderly man from his own property. They wanted to drag me out in a straitjacket to complete their narrative of severe cognitive decline. I listened as the heavy front door slammed shut. The engine of their leased luxury vehicle roared to life in the driveway. I stood up and walked to the window. I watched their car pull out onto the street and accelerate rapidly down the asphalt. The moment their taillights disappeared around the corner, the suffocating tension in the house instantly evaporated. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the deep, resonant silence of a battlefield cleared for a highly coordinated tactical strike. I walked downstairs and unlocked the front door. The time for passive observation was officially over. Exactly 4 minutes after Jared's vehicle turned the corner, the deep rumbling of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the quiet suburban street. 3 massive commercial moving trucks pulled up to my curb in a perfectly synchronized line. I had coordinated this logistical maneuver with Mitchell's trusted contractor late last night. The air brakes hissed loudly as a crew of 12 men in matching uniform shirts stepped out of the cabs. The foreman walked up my driveway holding a digital clipboard. I met him on the porch and verified my identity. I gave him a single, absolute directive. I instructed his team to pack, box, and remove every single physical item belonging to Jared and Megan. I wanted their entire existence completely scrubbed from the interior of my home. As the crew filed into the house carrying rolls of industrial bubble wrap and stacks of heavy-duty cardboard boxes, I felt a profound sense of structural cleansing. Jared and Megan had treated my home like a temporary storage facility for their unearned luxury. They had filled my guest rooms and my garage with the physical manifestations of their arrogance. They genuinely believed I was too weak and mentally compromised to challenge their spatial occupation. They assumed my house was merely a waiting room for my inevitable death. They were completely wrong. I was actively reclaiming my sanctuary square foot by square foot. I stood in the foyer and directed the foreman to the specific rooms they had contaminated. I watched the men begin their systematic dismantling of my son's artificial lifestyle. There was no room left for sentimentality. I was excising a cancer from the very foundation of my property. The moving crew executed their orders with absolute military precision. They swept through the house like a highly efficient storm. I stood in the hallway and watched without a single ounce of mercy as they dismantled the material evidence of Megan's extreme vanity. Her custom closet was entirely emptied in less than 20 minutes. The workers folded her silk dresses, packed her imported Italian leather handbags, and boxed up her absurdly expensive cosmetics. In the kitchen, 2 men carefully unplugged the massive chrome espresso machine she had purchased with my stolen equity. In the garage, another team packed Jared's custom-fitted golf clubs, his imported wine coolers, and his high-end electronic gaming equipment. I explicitly ordered the foreman not to damage a single item. I wanted their belongings perfectly preserved so they could not claim a single cent in property damage during the inevitable legal fallout. As the movers systematically emptied the rooms, a white commercial van pulled into the driveway. The specialized locksmith I had retained arrived right on schedule. He carried a heavy toolbox to the front door and immediately began extracting the old brass deadbolts. I ordered him to replace every single exterior lock on the property with high-grade commercial digital keypads. He stripped the hardware from the front door, the side garage entrance, and the sliding glass patio doors. He installed heavy, reinforced steel plates and programmed the new biometric entry codes directly into my phone. I deleted Jared's access privileges instantly. My home was transformed into an impenetrable fortress within a matter of hours. The physical vulnerabilities were entirely eliminated. They could no longer walk through my front door using the keys I had foolishly handed to them 3 years ago. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the interior of my house was completely unrecognizable. It was pristine, quiet, and entirely restored to its original state. The moving trucks had repositioned themselves at the edge of the street. Sitting neatly in the center of my wide concrete driveway were 50 heavy-duty cardboard boxes and several large pieces of contemporary furniture. The foreman had arranged their entire life into a perfect geometric grid outside my locked doors. The locksmith finished calibrating the final keypad and handed me the master administrative tablet. I walked the perimeter of the property and activated the brand new high-definition security cameras. The digital lenses hummed to life, sweeping the driveway, the porch, and the street with absolute clarity. The live feeds populated instantly on my tablet screen. I had established a flawless surveillance network to document the precise moment their fabricated reality completely collapsed. I locked the newly reinforced front door and engaged the electronic deadbolt with a solid mechanical click. I walked back into my meticulously clean kitchen. I took a deep breath of the quiet air. I reached for my favorite roasted coffee beans and began to brew a fresh pot. The rich, dark aroma filled the empty space, grounding me in the reality of my reclaimed independence. I poured the steaming coffee into my ceramic mug and walked into the living room. I sat down in my armchair facing the large front window that perfectly overlooked the stacks of boxes on the driveway. I set my tablet on the side table, keeping the camera feeds in my direct line of sight. The trap was perfectly laid. The fortress was sealed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and simply waited. The digital clock on my side table shifted to exactly 5 in the evening. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light across my immaculately clean living room. I sat perfectly still in my armchair with my ceramic mug of black coffee resting comfortably in my hand. My eyes remained locked on the high-definition security monitor streaming the live feed of my front driveway. A silver luxury sedan turned the corner and accelerated down the quiet suburban street with its usual aggressive and entitled speed. Jared was behind the wheel. The car swerved sharply into my driveway and then violently slammed on the brakes. The heavy tires screeched loudly against the concrete, leaving dark rubber marks. The vehicle stopped mere inches from the imposing wall of 50 heavy-duty cardboard boxes blocking the entire entrance to the garage. The sudden violent halt threw both Jared and Megan forward against their seatbelts. I watched the live feed as the initial shock registered on their faces. They sat completely frozen inside the idling car for several long seconds, trying to process the impossible geometric grid of their packed belongings. The pristine leather interior of their vehicle suddenly looked like a very small cage. Jared killed the engine and threw his door open with excessive force. He stepped out onto the driveway, staring blindly at the towering stacks of cardboard. Megan scrambled out of the passenger side. Her designer heels clicked erratically and loudly against the pavement. She walked up to the nearest box and aggressively ripped the clear packing tape away. She stared down at her meticulously folded silk dresses and imported Italian handbags. The reality of the scene began to systematically crush her artificial reality. This was not a random delivery. This was not a mistake. This was an absolute and total extraction. They had left the house this morning believing they possessed the ultimate power to dictate my future and lock me away. They returned to find their entire existence permanently expelled from my sanctuary. Megan dropped the cardboard flap and sprinted frantically toward the front porch. She bounded up the concrete steps with a frantic, desperate energy that bordered on sheer panic. She reached deep into her expensive purse and pulled out the brass key I had foolishly given her 3 years ago. She shoved the jagged metal blindly toward the keyhole. The key simply scraped against solid, reinforced steel. The key did not turn. The key was completely useless. The old brass deadbolt was permanently gone. In its place sat the sleek black interface of a high-grade commercial digital keypad. Megan stared at the glowing blue numbers in absolute disbelief. She aggressively pushed the old key against the metal plate again and again, viciously scratching the dark surface. The mechanism remained completely locked. She dropped her keys onto the porch floorboards and slammed her open palms against the solid oak door. The heavy wood barely rattled under her frantic physical assault. She screamed my name, demanding that I open the door this very second. Jared ran up the steps immediately behind her. His face was flushed crimson with a volatile mixture of raw panic and explosive rage. He shoved Megan aside and grabbed the heavy brass handle, pulling it violently backward. The door did not yield a single millimeter. He began to pound his closed fists against the wood with maximum physical force. He shouted that I was completely out of my mind. He yelled that he had explicit legal rights to enter the property. He demanded I stop playing these insane games before he called the authorities to physically drag me out into the street. He was still desperately clinging to the manufactured narrative of my cognitive decline. He truly believed this was merely the erratic behavior of a senile old man having a random paranoid episode. He had absolutely no idea that every single physical asset he owned was currently sitting in cheap cardboard boxes directly behind him. He failed to comprehend that the legal foundation of his entire life had been completely obliterated while he was busy arranging a fraudulent ambulance transport for his own father. I stood up from my armchair and walked slowly into the foyer. I carried my ceramic mug with perfectly steady hands. Not a single drop of dark coffee spilled over the rim. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the interior of the front door. The heavy oak completely muffled their frantic screaming, reducing their immense rage to pathetic, muffled thuds. I looked at the master administrative tablet mounted securely on the hallway wall. The high-definition camera perfectly framed their distorted, panicked faces. Megan's flawless cosmetic application was running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Her carefully crafted facade of upper-class superiority had entirely melted away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered desperation of a cornered predator. Jared was actively losing his mind. He paced furiously back and forth across the narrow porch, stepping directly into the camera lens. He pointed his finger aggressively at the camera housing and screamed that he was going to break the front window if I did not disable the digital lock immediately. He threatened to drag me out of the house by my collar. He promised to have me permanently locked inside a psychiatric ward before the sun went down. His threats were meaningless static against the structural integrity of my countermeasures. The contrast between our realities was absolute. Outside, my son was thrashing against an impenetrable barrier, screaming into the empty void. Inside, I stood in absolute silence, breathing the calm, clean air of my reclaimed and fortified home. I watched him clench his fist tightly and step heavily toward the large bay window. He was preparing to cross the final boundary into physical violence. He was ready to destroy my physical property to maintain his parasitic financial control. I knew I had to deliver the final psychological strike before he shattered the glass and forced a physical confrontation. I placed my coffee mug gently onto the polished surface of the foyer console table. I reached out and pressed my index finger firmly against the glowing blue intercom button on the security tablet. The two-way audio channel engaged with a sharp, piercing digital chime. The exterior speakers mounted directly above the porch crackled to life with a low hum. Jared froze mid-stride with his fist raised dangerously toward the fragile window pane. Megan gasped sharply and stepped backward, looking up at the black speaker box in pure shock. The sudden, unexpected electronic noise completely paralyzed them. I leaned closer to the integrated microphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not project anger. I did not project fear. I spoke with the absolute cold precision of a judge delivering a final, unalterable sentence. My voice boomed clearly across the driveway, echoing against the stacked cardboard boxes and rolling down the quiet suburban street. I stated simply that all the old, useless junk had been permanently removed from the premises. I instructed them to get off my property immediately before I contacted the local police department to aggressively enforce a criminal trespassing violation. The heavy, dead silence that followed my declaration was profoundly satisfying. Jared dropped his raised fist slowly to his side. His jaw went completely slack. The sheer absolute clarity of my steady voice shattered his entire carefully constructed narrative in an instant. There was no confusion. There was no senility. There was no cognitive decline. There was only the calculated, methodical execution of a man who had completely and utterly outmaneuvered him. Megan grabbed his arm frantically while her eyes widened with genuine absolute terror. She realized instantly that the fraudulent psychiatric hold they had arranged that morning was now completely useless. A senile man does not hire a professional moving crew. A senile man does not change all the exterior locks to biometric keypads. A senile man does not issue a legally sound eviction warning through a high-definition surveillance system. The illusion was officially dead. The ironclad trap had finally snapped shut. Megan did not simply lose her temper. She lost her entire constructed reality. She threw herself against the heavy oak door with the unrestrained fury of a cornered animal. She kicked the solid wood. She kicked the solid wood again. She kicked the solid wood until the impact reverberated through the thick foundation of the house. Her designer heels scraped violently against the porch planks, leaving deep, ugly gouges in the paint. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she would sue me. She screamed she would sue me for every single penny I had ever earned. She shrieked about emotional distress. She shrieked about illegal eviction. She shrieked about catastrophic property damage. Her voice cracked under the immense strain of her own hysteria. She pounded her fists against the doorframe until her knuckles turned a bruised and angry red. Jared stood behind her, attempting to salvage whatever pathetic fraction of masculine authority he believed he still possessed. He stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, but she violently swatted it away. Jared puffed out his chest and directed his voice toward the high-definition camera mounted above the porch. He commanded me to open the door immediately. He commanded me to stop this ridiculous nonsense. He commanded me to let them inside before he called his lawyer to tear my life apart. His tone was a desperate imitation of control. He tried to project the commanding presence of a successful man, but his voice trembled with undeniable fear. He was a hollow shell of a man, pretending to give orders to a fortress. He demanded compliance from a father he had actively tried to destroy. I remained perfectly still in the hallway, watching their public unraveling through the glowing screen of my tablet. The silence inside my home was absolute. The chaos outside my home was magnificent. I picked up the thick manila envelope I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I walked slowly from the living room to the front foyer, holding my ceramic coffee mug in my free hand. The frantic pounding against the exterior wood continued without any pause. I knelt down on the polished hardwood floor right next to the brass mail slot built into the base of the door. I pushed the heavy envelope through the narrow metal opening. The thick paper slid smoothly across the brass edge and dropped directly onto the porch with a soft thud. The pounding stopped instantly. The sudden silence was heavier than the screaming. I watched the security monitor as Jared looked down at the package. He bent over and snatched the envelope from the wooden floorboards. He ripped the sealed flap open with trembling, aggressive fingers. He pulled out the crisp stack of legal documents. I had placed the primary bank confirmation right on top. Jared stared at the zero balance notification. He stared at the permanent closure stamp. He stared at the ultimate destruction of his financial pipeline. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent white. His eyes darted frantically across the numbers, searching for a loophole that did not exist. He flipped to the second document. It was the formal, irrevocable trust transfer. It was the absolute legal severing of my ownership. Jared read the exact clauses Mitchell had drafted with lethal precision. He read that the house no longer belonged to me. He read that my liquid assets no longer belonged to me. He realized his forged signature was now completely useless against a corporate trust. He realized the hundreds of hours he spent practicing my handwriting were entirely wasted. The fabricated power of attorney was dead. The equity was dead. His future was dead. He staggered backward and leaned heavily against the brick pillar of the porch. I reached out and pressed the blue intercom button on the wall-mounted tablet. My voice sliced through the heavy suburban air with absolute clinical detachment. I did not yell. I did not whisper. I spoke with the terrible weight of absolute finality. I informed my son that the home equity line of credit was completely paid off. I informed my son that the account was permanently closed. I informed my son that the digital pipeline he had built with his forged signature was entirely incinerated. I watched his shoulders collapse as my voice echoed across the driveway. I explained the exact nature of his defeat. I told him the house he was trying to steal no longer belonged to me. The property belonged to the trust. The assets belonged to the trust. The entire estate was shielded by a legal fortress he could never penetrate. I let the reality of his failure settle over him. I told him his pathetic attempt to lock me inside a medical facility was built on a financial premise that no longer existed. He could not sell a house I did not own. He could not drain accounts I no longer controlled. His forged documents were nothing more than criminal evidence waiting to be handed over to a federal prosecutor. I watched Jared look at the security camera with a hollow, devastated stare. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant corporate predator who had plotted my total erasure was completely broken. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage. He possessed no money. He possessed no home. He possessed no power over the man he had severely underestimated. The intercom clicked off, leaving him to stand in the deafening silence of his own absolute ruin. Megan did not stand still to mourn the loss of the estate. Megan operated purely on ruthless survival instincts. She lunged forward and snatched the thick stack of legal papers directly out of Jared's limp hands. She flipped through the bank statements and the trust documents with rapid, calculated movements. Her eyes scanned the zero balances and the irrevocable clauses. She comprehended the totality of the financial destruction in seconds. The phantom wealth she had been spending was completely gone. The luxury vacations were gone. The designer lifestyle was gone. She looked at Jared. She looked at the man she had married for his perceived access to my legacy. The anger in her eyes instantly shifted from chaotic hysteria to a cold, vicious calculation. She realized Jared was no longer an asset. Jared was a massive legal and financial liability. He was a man facing federal fraud charges with absolutely zero capital to defend himself. She tossed the legal documents onto the porch floorboards like worthless trash. She stepped away from him as if he were carrying a contagious disease. She did not yell at him anymore. She simply pulled her expensive smartphone from her pocket. She looked directly into the security camera lens with a terrifying, dead expression. She lifted the phone to her ear. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call a real estate agent. She bypassed the local police department entirely. Megan dialed the emergency dispatch number. She was executing her ultimate pivot. She was preparing to burn Jared to the ground to save herself. I stood in the foyer watching her wait for the emergency dispatcher to answer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I located the pristine audio recording from the kitchen. I attached the file containing Jared's full confession. I pressed send and routed it directly to Mitchell's secure server. I stood perfectly still in the quiet shadows of my foyer. The high-definition monitor illuminated the absolute madness unfolding on my front porch. Megan held her mobile phone tightly to her ear. I watched her posture transform in real time. The cold, calculating predator vanished. The terrified, helpless victim emerged. She forced a violent sob from her throat. She forced a second sob to ensure the emergency dispatcher heard the manufactured terror in her voice. She began to speak with a frantic, breathless cadence. She screamed into the receiver that her father-in-law was experiencing a severe and violent dementia episode. She claimed I was completely unhinged. She claimed I was completely out of control. She claimed I had suddenly barricaded the house and violently thrown their belongings into the street. She painted a vivid masterpiece of absolute fiction. She told the operator that I was an immediate danger to myself. She told the operator that I was a lethal danger to them. She begged for an emergency psychiatric intervention. She begged for the police to come and secure the premises before I severely hurt someone. Every single syllable she uttered was a calculated weapon. She knew exactly what words triggered a massive, rapid police response. She weaponized my advancing age. She weaponized my fabricated mental decline. The sheer ease with which she lied was staggering. She did not hesitate. She did not stumble over her words. She delivered a flawless theatrical performance designed to legally neutralize me. I watched her wipe a non-existent tear from her cheek. I watched her clutch her chest in mock agony. She was laying the groundwork for my immediate forced institutionalization right there on my own concrete steps. The trap she was building was designed to snap shut the moment the authorities arrived. Jared understood the catastrophic reality of her phone call instantly. He knew the police would demand documentation. He knew the police would ask highly intrusive questions. He knew the police would inevitably uncover the forged signatures anchoring the fraudulent bank loan. The arrival of law enforcement was no longer a convenient tool for my eviction. The arrival of law enforcement was a direct, unavoidable path to his federal indictment. He lunged forward and desperately tried to snatch the mobile phone directly out of Megan's manicured hand. He commanded her to hang up immediately. He commanded her to stop talking. He commanded her to walk away before she dragged them both into a massive criminal prosecution. Megan violently shoved him backward against the brick pillar of the porch. She covered the microphone and hissed at him to remain entirely silent. She was entirely committed to her manufactured victim narrative. She believed her hysterical tears were an impenetrable shield. She deeply trusted her ability to manipulate the incoming officers. She trusted her youth. She trusted her privilege. She calculated that responding officers would instinctively side with a sobbing, terrified young woman over an aging black man locked inside a dark house. She assumed my physical appearance and my demographic reality would automatically validate her claims of violent, erratic behavior. She weaponized the ugliest societal assumptions to guarantee my total destruction. Jared stood frozen on the porch, paralyzed by the inescapable jaws of his own trap. He watched his wife finalize the emergency dispatch call, knowing she had just summoned the very authorities who would discover his financial crimes. He was completely trapped between the absolute ruin of his financial pipeline and the imminent arrival of a criminal investigation. Megan disconnected the call and glared at the heavy oak door. She smiled a vicious, triumphant smile. I did not panic. I did not allow a single drop of fear to enter my bloodstream. I turned away from the glowing security monitor and walked deliberately toward the kitchen island. I needed to construct an impenetrable physical defense to counter her highly theatrical hysteria. I placed the certified emergency eviction order precisely in the center of the cold granite counter. The judge's blue ink signature gleamed under the recessed ceiling lighting. I placed the thick stack of financial documents directly next to the eviction order. The bank confirmation of the terminated credit line sat perfectly aligned with the irrevocable trust transfer paperwork. I retrieved the digital audio recorder from my deep trouser pocket. I placed the small black device right beside the legal documents. The recorder held the pristine, unalterable audio file of Jared's explicit confession. It held the irrefutable acoustic proof of his premeditated forgery. I meticulously arranged the truth into a flawless, undeniable presentation. The narrative Megan was spinning to the emergency dispatchers was built entirely on a hollow foundation of emotional manipulation. My counter-narrative was built entirely on hard, authenticated legal facts. I left the kitchen and walked slowly to the hall closet. I pulled my tailored charcoal suit jacket from the wooden hanger. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and adjusted the heavy fabric over my shoulders. I smoothed the lapels and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I did not look like a violent dementia patient. I did not look like an erratic, out-of-control senior citizen. I looked exactly like the highly educated, meticulous professional engineer I had been my entire life. I dressed for absolute authority. I dressed for absolute credibility. I buttoned the center button of my jacket and stood tall. I was completely ready for the collision. The distant wail of emergency sirens pierced the quiet suburban evening. The high-pitched mechanical scream cut through the thick air, signaling the rapid, aggressive approach of the local authorities. The sirens grew louder. The sirens grew sharper. The sirens grew incredibly close. I watched the live video feed as the flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding houses in frantic, alternating colors. 2 heavy police patrol cars turned the corner at maximum speed. They did not park neatly on the edge of the street. They violently hopped the concrete curb and screeched to a sudden halt directly on my manicured front lawn. The heavy tires tore deep, jagged trenches into the green grass. The sheer, aggressive nature of their arrival proved exactly how effectively Megan had communicated her fabricated terror. 4 uniformed officers threw their heavy car doors open before the vehicles completely settled into the dirt. Megan did not waste a single second. She launched herself down the porch steps and sprinted directly toward the closest patrol car. She threw her hands into the air and unleashed a masterclass of hysterical sobbing. She stumbled across the concrete driveway, dropping to her knees just as the first officer reached her. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my locked front door. She pointed at my fortified sanctuary. She pointed at the house she had desperately tried to steal. She screamed that I was heavily armed and completely out of my mind. She screamed that they needed to break down the door to save them from my violence. The officers instantly drew their hands to their tactical belts and turned their hardened, aggressive focus entirely upon my home. The chaotic climax she orchestrated was officially underway. The trap was fully sprung. I watched the officers advance toward my porch. I took a deep breath and walked to the door. The 4 police officers advanced up the concrete driveway in a tight tactical formation. Their heavy black boots struck the pavement with fast, deliberate steps. Their hands rested firmly against their heavy leather duty belts. Their eyes scanned the massive mountain of cardboard boxes before locking intensely onto my reinforced front door. Megan threw herself directly into their path. She did not hesitate for a second. She did not stumble over her words. She launched into a breathless, highly theatrical monologue designed to secure my immediate, forceful arrest. She shrieked that her elderly father-in-law had just suffered a violent psychotic break. She shrieked that I had aggressively barricaded myself inside the home with dangerous weapons. She shrieked that I had mindlessly thrown their precious, expensive belongings out onto the cold driveway in a fit of absolute senile rage. She wept uncontrollably. She trembled violently. She painted a masterful masterpiece of fictional domestic terror. She begged the officers to break down the door before I completely destroyed the property or lethally harmed myself. Jared stood immediately behind her, nodding in solemn, calculated agreement. He played the role of the deeply concerned son with sickening, practiced ease. The lead officer stepped quickly around Megan and approached the front porch. He was a tall, imposing man wearing a thick, tactical vest and a deeply serious expression. He stopped exactly 2 feet from the solid oak door. He raised his heavy fist and slammed it against the wood with incredible physical force. The heavy thuds echoed violently through my foyer. He slammed his fist again. He commanded me to open the door immediately. He commanded me to step outside with my hands entirely visible. He commanded me to comply with his strict orders or face an immediate forced entry. The tension outside reached an absolute boiling point. I did not cower in the shadows of my own home. I did not hide behind the heavy reinforced door like a frightened animal. I reached out and deactivated the biometric lock with a single smooth, confident motion. The heavy steel bolts retracted instantly with a sharp mechanical click. I grasped the cold brass handle and pulled the oak door wide open. I stepped out onto the top of the front porch and faced the 4 heavily armed police officers. I did not tremble in fear. I did not raise my voice in panic. I stood perfectly straight with my shoulders pulled back and my chin held firmly high. I projected the absolute unyielding authority of a man who had commanded massive hostile construction crews for 40 grueling years. I had stared down aggressive labor strikes. I had stared down corrupt city inspectors. I had stared down massive logistical failures on multi-million-dollar industrial job sites. 4 confused police officers standing on my porch did not intimidate me. They did not frighten me in the slightest. They did not break my absolute unshakable focus. The lead officer took a sudden, involuntary step backward. He fully expected to confront a deranged, violent senior citizen covered in sweat and manic paranoia. He expected a chaotic, loud shouting match. Instead, he was instantly met with a meticulously groomed professional wearing a tailored charcoal suit projecting total, absolute calm. He looked down at my polished leather shoes. He looked up at my perfectly knotted silk tie. He looked directly into my steady, unwavering gaze. The sharp, aggressive tension in his broad shoulders immediately evaporated. His right hand slowly moved away from his tactical belt. The hysterical narrative Megan had frantically spun was instantly contradicted by my sheer physical presence. The lead officer cleared his throat nervously and asked me to explain the massive pile of boxes currently blocking my entire garage. He asked me to calmly explain the hysterical allegations of a violent psychotic episode happening inside my home. I did not answer him with defensive, nervous excuses. I did not answer him with emotional, frantic justifications. I answered him with cold, hard, certified legal documentation. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope. I handed the sealed package directly to the lead officer without a single tremor in my hand. I instructed him to review the top document immediately. He pulled out the heavy legal paper and began to read the bold text. I spoke in a clear, deep, resonant voice that carried across the entire front lawn, ensuring every single officer heard my exact words. I stated clearly that the 2 individuals standing on my grass were absolute criminal trespassers. I stated clearly that they had absolutely zero legal right to occupy my home. I stated clearly that their personal belongings had been lawfully, meticulously, and professionally removed from my private property earlier this afternoon. I told the officer that there was absolutely no psychotic break. I told the officer that there was absolutely no violent dementia episode. There was only a strict legal emergency eviction executed perfectly within the hard boundaries of the law. I watched the officer read the precise legal language drafted by my ruthless attorney. I watched his eyes repeatedly scan the official blue ink signature of the acting county judge. I watched him process the irrefutable absolute truth of my complete property ownership. The detailed document outlined their total removal. The officer's strict aggressive demeanor shifted directly into absolute professional compliance. Megan stopped her theatrical, uncontrollable sobbing the exact second I handed over the legal documents. She realized instantly that her emotional manipulation was fundamentally failing. She realized her perfectly crafted victim narrative was rapidly crumbling under the heavy weight of actual authenticated paperwork. She marched aggressively up the concrete steps and inserted herself directly between the lead officer and my open front door. She scoffed loudly and pointing a sharp manicured finger directly at the document resting in the officer's hands. She shrieked that the paper was a complete, absolute forgery. She shrieked that I was a pathetic, senile old man entirely incapable of securing a real court order. She shrieked that I had likely printed a fake fraudulent document off the internet to falsely justify my insane paranoid delusions. She demanded the officer arrest me immediately for severe property damage and elder madness. She demanded he completely ignore the worthless paper and put me in heavy metal handcuffs right now. Jared stepped up right beside her, loudly echoing her frantic, desperate accusations. The lead officer ignored their escalating joint hysteria entirely. He raised the heavy document up to the fading sunlight and carefully examined the bottom corner. He examined the raised physical seal of the official county courthouse. He examined the authenticated complex watermark embedded directly into the heavy paper stock. He verified the explicit legal case number printed boldly at the top of the page. He verified the undeniable concrete reality of my absolute legal triumph. He lowered the document slowly and turned his body to squarely face Megan. He did not look sympathetic whatsoever. He did not look emotionally manipulated. His right hand dropped down and rested firmly against the heavy black radio on his duty belt. He stated clearly, "Ma'am, this order is valid." The lead officer's declaration hung in the air, completely neutralizing Megan's manufactured hysteria. Jared stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating, desperate gesture. He attempted to interject, his voice cracking as he stammered out a pathetic string of excuses. He tried to frame the entire eviction and his presence on my porch as a massive, unfortunate family misunderstanding. He spoke rapidly, trying to regain control of the narrative before the officers could fully process the legal weight of the eviction order. He claimed I was simply confused about my own financial decisions and that he was only trying to manage my estate for my own protection. He insisted that the stress of the day had caused me to overreact and that they simply needed to go inside to calm me down. I did not let him finish his fabricated explanation. I did not engage in a shouting match or attempt to verbally counter his desperate lies. I simply reached into my tailored suit jacket and retrieved my mobile phone. The digital audio file was already queued up and ready on the screen. I maximized the volume on the device and pressed the play button. The silence on the porch was instantly shattered by the crisp, undeniable sound of Jared's own voice. The recording from yesterday evening played with absolute clarity. The audio quality was immaculate, capturing every single nuance of his panic and his guilt. The officers immediately stopped writing in their notepads and looked up, their professional attention snapping entirely to the device in my hand. Jared froze, his mouth hanging half open as his own recorded words began to narrate his absolute destruction. His attempt to play the role of the caring, responsible son evaporated into the cold suburban air. Jared's recorded voice echoed loudly from the small speaker bouncing off the brick pillars of the porch. The audio captured him explicitly detailing his criminal methodology. He confessed to stealing the old municipal contract from my private office. He admitted to spending 3 grueling weeks at his desk meticulously practicing the exact curvature of my handwriting. He stated clearly that he forged my signature to secure the $150,000 home equity line of credit. The recording played his panicked realization that the bank's internal fraud department flagged the application. He explicitly acknowledged his premeditated theft and his intent to drain my assets. The 4 police officers reacted with immediate, synchronized tactical precision. The lead officer raised his hand, signaling his team. 2 officers quickly stepped forward and physically separated Jared and Megan. They moved Jared down to the base of the concrete steps, isolating him completely from his wife and from my front door. Megan tried to follow him, but a 3rd officer stepped firmly into her path, ordering her to remain exactly where she was. The dynamic on the driveway shifted instantly from a domestic dispute into an active criminal investigation. The officers adopted a rigid defensive posture, treating Jared no longer as a concerned family member, but as a direct suspect in a major felony. Jared looked around wildly, completely trapped between the armed officers and the mountain of cardboard boxes containing his former life. His physical isolation mirrored his absolute legal isolation. The recorded confession continued to play, stripping away every single layer of his defense, leaving him entirely exposed under the harsh scrutiny of law enforcement. He could not deny the sound of his own voice, detailing the exact mechanics of his calculated betrayal. I allowed the recording to play until the very last damning syllable before silencing the device. The air was thick with the undeniable reality of his guilt. I turned my attention back to the lead officer. I reached into the thick manila envelope and pulled out the comprehensive bank fraud report. This dossier was meticulously prepared by Mitchell, my corporate attorney, and certified by the bank's lead fraud investigator. I handed the heavy stack of documents directly to the officer. I informed him that the report contained the authenticated banking logs, the original forged loan application, and the sworn affidavit from the bank manager detailing the unauthorized access. The evidence was complete, cross-referenced, and legally binding. I looked directly at the lead officer, maintaining my absolute composure. I stated my intentions with cold, unwavering precision. I formally demanded the immediate arrest of Jared and Megan. I listed the specific charges with absolute clarity. I demanded they be charged with aggravated identity theft. I demanded they be charged with first-degree bank fraud. I demanded they be charged with premeditated elder financial abuse. I did not ask for a future investigation. I did not ask for a police report to be filed for a later date. I demanded immediate physical consequence for their actions. The paper trail was ironclad, and the audio confession provided the undeniable intent. I had handed the police department a fully prosecuted case tied up with a neat legal bow. Megan stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the trap I had sprung. She realized that every single move they made over the past 3 years had been documented, analyzed, and weaponized against them. The lead officer opened the fraud report and silently reviewed the top pages. His eyes scanned the bank's official letterhead, the detailed transaction logs, and the explicit summary of the forged documents. He flipped to the second page, verifying the signature analysis provided by the financial institution. The overwhelming weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. The domestic disturbance call had officially transformed into a major felony arrest. The officer slowly closed the folder and handed it to his partner for securing into evidence. He adjusted his heavy tactical belt and took a slow, deliberate step down the porch stairs toward the driveway. The metallic click of metal against metal broke the tense silence. He reached to his hip and unclipped his heavy steel handcuffs. The sound was sharp and definitive. Jared's eyes widened in absolute terror as he watched the officer approach. His knees visibly buckled, his entire body trembling under the crushing weight of his imminent incarceration. The officer stopped directly in front of him, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or escape. He looked Jared squarely in the eyes with a cold, professional detachment. The officer did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He issued a single, terrifying command. He asked Jared to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The absolute finality of the instruction hung in the air, signaling the total, irreversible destruction of Jared's life. He had nowhere left to run, no lies left to spin, and no money left to steal. He slowly turned his body, offering his wrist to the cold steel, fully comprehending that his arrogant attempt to discard me had ended in his own permanent ruin. The sharp metallic snap of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the quiet suburban driveway. The sound possessed an absolute terminal finality. The lead officer secured the thick metal rings tightly around Jared's wrists, forcing his arms awkwardly behind his back. The physical reality of his immediate arrest crashed down upon my son with the devastating weight of a collapsing building. His knees visibly buckled under the immense sudden gravity of a federal indictment. The officer maintained a firm, unyielding grip on Jared's upper arm, keeping him upright against the side of the patrol car. Jared's chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as he desperately tried to pull oxygen into his hyperventilating lungs. The flawless corporate armor he had worn for the past 3 years completely disintegrated, leaving behind a terrified, trembling child. He stared blankly at the rough concrete beneath his expensive leather shoes. The illusion of his impenetrable intelligence was permanently shattered. He finally understood the inescapable consequences of his premeditated financial crimes. He was no longer a wealthy suburban homeowner dictating the terms of my existence. He was an identified felony suspect bound for a sterile concrete cell. The flashing red and blue emergency lights painted his pale, sweating face in harsh, unforgiving strokes. The absolute silence of his submission proved that he recognized the complete destruction of his future. The bank fraud report I had handed the authorities was an ironclad labyrinth he could never navigate his way out of. He squeezed his eyes shut as the second officer began a thorough physical search of his tailored pockets. The cold, humiliating reality of the criminal justice system stripped away his final remaining shred of dignity right in front of the massive barricade of his packed belongings. Megan watched the officer physically restrain her husband with wide, terrified eyes. Her sophisticated predatory instincts instantly calculated the catastrophic trajectory of the situation. She recognized immediately that the sinking ship was taking on massive amounts of water, and she refused to drown alongside the captain. The shared criminal alliance they had forged against me evaporated the second the handcuffs clicked into place. Megan took a rapid, deliberate step away from Jared, physically distancing herself from the epicenter of the felony arrest. She turned her entire body toward the lead officer and unleashed a torrential flood of calculated tears. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at the man she had sworn to love and protect. Her voice rose into a frantic, piercing shriek as she explicitly threw Jared to the wolves. She screamed that she had absolutely no idea the bank signatures were forged. She wailed that Jared handled all the financial documentation in absolute secrecy. She constructed a desperate, instantaneous narrative framing herself as a completely innocent, financially abused spouse. She claimed Jared had forced her to participate in the eviction by feeding her a steady diet of malicious lies regarding my mental health. She painted him as a controlling, manipulative monster who had deceived her just as thoroughly as he had deceived the bank. She aggressively disavowed any knowledge of the stolen home equity line of credit. She swore to the officers that she thought the money came from his legitimate corporate bonuses. She willingly offered to testify against him in a federal court if it meant securing her own freedom. She deployed every single weapon in her emotional arsenal to convince the police that she was merely collateral damage in his solitary criminal enterprise. Jared slowly lifted his head and stared at his wife in a state of absolute catatonic shock. The sheer velocity of her betrayal left him completely breathless. The woman for whom he had orchestrated my total financial ruin was now actively volunteering to be the primary witness for his prosecution. He had stolen my municipal contracts, practiced my signature until his hands bled, and risked a decade in federal prison entirely to fund her insatiable appetite for luxury. He had traded his own flesh and blood for her approval. He watched the vicious ease with which she discarded him the absolute second the stolen funds dried up. He tasted the exact bitter flavor of the betrayal he had so casually served me. The agonizing realization washed over his pale face. He had burned down his only genuine family to warm a woman who felt absolutely no loyalty to him whatsoever. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the profound psychological devastation rendered him completely mute. He looked at Megan pleadingly, searching her cold, calculating eyes for a single ounce of the partnership they had shared just 20 minutes ago. He found absolutely nothing but hollow self-preservation. She glared back at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She viewed him no longer as a provider, but as a toxic liability that needed to be aggressively amputated. The poetic justice of the moment was absolute. Jared was forced to swallow the toxic poison of extreme familial betrayal while standing in handcuffs on the driveway of the father he had tried to destroy. The agonizing silence between them spoke volumes about the hollow, rotting core of their fraudulent marriage. The lead officer listened to Megan's frantic, desperate monologue with an expression of total, stone-faced indifference. He did not offer her a single word of comfort. He did not lower his defensive, tactical posture. He simply reached into the manila folder and extracted the third page of Mitchell's comprehensive fraud report. He held the document up and read the highlighted text aloud in a clear, booming voice. He informed Megan that her claims of financial ignorance were completely contradicted by the authenticated banking logs. He stated explicitly that the stolen $150,000 had not been deposited into a joint checking account. The money had been wire transferred directly into the primary operating account of her private luxury consulting LLC. She was not a passive bystander. She was the sole legal beneficiary of the stolen equity. The officer stepped forward and unclipped a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his duty belt. He informed her that she was being placed under immediate arrest for receiving stolen federal funds and active conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Megan let out a blood-curdling scream of pure feral panic. The calculated victim facade shattered instantly. As the officer reached for her wrist, she violently jerked her arm away and thrashed backward. She lost her balance on her towering designer heels and collapsed hard onto the abrasive concrete driveway. She kicked and screamed wildly, scratching at the officer's hands. Her expensive silk dress tore against the rough asphalt. The pristine fabric shredded instantly, exposing her bleeding, scraped knees. Two officers grabbed her flailing arms and pinned her firmly against the ground, securing the heavy metal cuffs around her wrists while she sobbed into the dirt. The officers hauled Megan up from the rough asphalt. Her knees were bloodied and her expensive silk dress hung in ruined shreds. They marched her toward the second patrol car parked on my ruined lawn. She continued to thrash and scream vicious insults, but her voice was quickly muffled as the heavy door slammed shut behind her. The lead officer took Jared by the arm and guided him toward the primary vehicle parked in the center of the driveway. Jared did not resist. He walked with a heavy, defeated shuffle. The fight had entirely drained from his body. The officer pressed a heavy hand against Jared's shoulder and forced him to duck into the cramped back seat. The metal handcuffs clinked sharply against the plastic interior. Before the officer could swing the door closed, Jared threw his upper body sideways across the leather seat. He wedged his shoulder into the doorframe, preventing it from latching. He looked up at the officer with wide, terrified eyes. He begged for exactly 60 seconds to speak with his father. He pleaded that this was a massive familial misunderstanding that could be resolved without destroying his entire future. The lead officer looked back at me, standing quietly on the porch. He evaluated my absolute calm demeanor and the comprehensive legal paperwork I had provided. The officer nodded once. He stepped back slightly and left the rear door hanging open. He warned Jared to keep his voice down and make it incredibly brief. Jared awkwardly pushed himself upward against the restrictive metal cuffs. He shifted his weight to face the exterior of the vehicle. He stared at me through the narrow gap in the doorframe. His chest heaved with shallow, desperate breaths as he prepared his final defense. Jared pressed his sweating face toward the open gap. He looked absolutely wretched. The immaculate corporate image he cultivated with such aggressive arrogance had completely dissolved into pathetic, trembling cowardice. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the nervous sweat. He sobbed openly. He begged me to contact Mitchell and withdraw the criminal complaint. He promised to sign any document I wanted. He promised to manually repay every single stolen dollar with heavy interest. He pleaded that federal prison would absolutely destroy him. He refused to take a single ounce of personal accountability for his meticulously calculated crimes. He instantly launched into a frantic, disorganized barrage of cowardly excuses. He blamed the volatile economy for crushing his personal investments. He claimed the crushing pressure of inflation forced him into a desperate financial corner. He blamed his failing digital startup. He even blamed the overall real estate market. Then he viciously turned his verbal assault directly onto his own wife. He claimed Megan was an insatiable financial monster. He insisted she relentlessly demanded luxury vacations and premium vehicles he simply could not afford. He swore that she manipulated him into forging the signature to maintain her extravagant lifestyle. He portrayed himself as a tragic victim of a greedy, demanding spouse and an unforgiving economic climate. He painted a pathetic picture of a man who simply made one minor error in judgment under extreme domestic duress. He entirely ignored the reality that he spent weeks perfecting my signature. He entirely ignored the reality that he orchestrated a fraudulent psychiatric transport to lock me away forever. He pleaded for a fatherly compassion he had actively planned to exploit. He desperately hoped my parental instincts would override the cold, hard facts resting in the police officer's hands. I stepped off the front porch and walked slowly across the concrete driveway. The soles of my polished leather shoes crunched softly against the loose gravel. I did not rush. I approached the open door of the patrol car with steady, deliberate steps. I stopped exactly 1 foot away from the vehicle. I looked down at the weeping, broken man slouched across the plastic back seat. I searched my own chest for a familiar spark of paternal warmth. I searched for pity. I searched for a lingering fragment of heartbreak. I found absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my blood. There was only a profound, absolute freezing emptiness. It was the sterile silence of a surgically removed tumor. I looked directly into Jared's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level and devastatingly quiet. I told him that he was wasting his breath begging a stranger for clemency. I told him he stopped being my son the precise moment he sat at his desk and traced my name onto a fraudulent bank document. I told him he severed our bloodline the exact day he calculated my life was worth significantly less than his failing crypto portfolio. I stated clearly that a son protects his father from the wolves. A son does not invite the wolves inside the house and hand them the keys. He had traded his heritage for temporary artificial wealth. He had traded his soul to appease a woman who despised him. I informed him that my mercy had completely evaporated the moment I heard his recorded voice discussing my forced psychiatric confinement. I was no longer his father. I was simply the man executing the absolute legal consequences of his unmitigated greed. Jared let out a loud, agonizing wail. The sound was raw and primal. It was the sound of a man completely comprehending his own terminal self-destruction. The lead officer stepped forward immediately. He placed his heavy hand flat against the exterior of the door. He did not ask for permission. He firmly pushed the heavy metal door shut, cutting off Jared's pathetic sobbing with a loud, definitive slam. The heavy locking mechanism engaged with a sharp clack. The physical barrier between my peaceful reality and his criminal nightmare was permanently sealed. I did not offer a final wave. I did not offer a lingering look of regret. I simply turned my back on the flashing emergency lights and walked steadily toward my front porch. I climbed the concrete steps and stood tall beside my reinforced oak door. The powerful engines of the 2 police cruisers roared to life simultaneously. The heavy tires rolled backward off my damaged lawn and aligned perfectly with the asphalt street. The officers did not activate their wailing sirens. They did not need to announce their departure. They simply engaged their flashing red and blue strobes and accelerated down the quiet suburban road. I watched the dual sets of red taillights fade into the approaching dusk. The heavy vehicles carried the toxic, treacherous weight of my past completely out of my existence. I looked down at the massive mountain of cardboard boxes stacked neatly on my driveway. The physical remnants of their fraudulent lifestyle were completely isolated. The toxic element was excised. The parasitic threat was officially neutralized. I engaged the biometric keypad and walked inside my quiet, immaculate home. I had finally taken the trash out of my life for good. The deep silence that settled over my property was profound. The chaotic symphony of wailing sirens, hysterical shrieking, and panicked pleas had entirely vanished, absorbed by the quiet suburban evening. I stood in the center of my foyer and looked through the glass sidelight of the heavy oak door. My manicured front lawn bore the deep, jagged scars of the patrol car tires, a physical testament to the absolute destruction of Jared and Megan's fraudulent empire. The massive mountain of their cardboard boxes remained stacked on the concrete driveway, casting long, distorted shadows in the fading orange light of the setting sun. The air felt incredibly still. The suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for the past 3 years was completely gone. I walked slowly into the kitchen and began to prepare a quiet evening meal. 30 minutes later, the sharp beam of headlights swept across the dark glass of my front windows. A sleek black sedan pulled smoothly up to the curb, carefully avoiding the tire trenches on the grass. I watched the security monitor as Mitchell stepped out of the vehicle. My corporate attorney carried his heavy leather briefcase in his left hand and a premium bottle of aged single malt scotch in his right. He did not bother to ring the doorbell. He knocked twice with a firm, rhythmic cadence that signaled absolute victory. I opened the door to greet him. Mitchell wore a sharp, predatory smile that perfectly matched his immaculate pinstripe suit. He stepped into the foyer and held up the heavy glass bottle of scotch. He announced that we had a highly successful legal execution to formally celebrate. I stepped aside and welcomed him into the absolute peace of my fortified home. We moved directly into the formal dining room. I retrieved 2 heavy crystal tumblers from the glass display cabinet while Mitchell opened his leather briefcase. He spread a fresh stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. The paperwork detailed the immediate explosive fallout of our meticulously executed trap. Mitchell did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He dove straight into the cold, hard numbers. He informed me that the federal authorities had moved with astonishing speed the moment the patrol cars reached the precinct. The Bank Fraud Division officially flagged Megan's luxury consulting enterprise as an active criminal vehicle. Federal investigators had already secured emergency injunctions to freeze every single asset tied to her limited liability company. The stolen $150,000 was completely locked down, and the bank was actively initiating aggressive seizure protocols to recover the funds. Megan would not have access to a single penny to fund her legal defense. Mitchell then turned his sharp focus to Jared's specific legal reality. The forged municipal contracts, the falsified equity loan, and the recorded audio confession constituted a devastating prosecutorial package. The federal prosecutor was actively drafting charges that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Jared had zero leverage and absolutely zero avenues for a plea bargain that avoided hard time. Their luxurious suburban lifestyle, built entirely on a foundation of my stolen wealth, was completely obliterated. They were facing immediate catastrophic bankruptcy alongside their felony convictions. The vehicles would be repossessed. Their rented townhouse would inevitably evict them. The absolute financial ruin Megan had arrogantly planned for my retirement was now completely inverted and crashing down directly upon her own perfectly manicured head. Mitchell finished delivering his precise legal summary and leaned back into the heavy wooden dining chair. He watched me carefully as I unsealed the bottle of aged scotch. The amber liquid poured smoothly into the heavy crystal tumblers, filling the quiet room with the rich, complex aroma of peat and oak. I handed him a glass and took a slow, deliberate sip from my own. The alcohol burned pleasantly against the back of my throat. Mitchell studied my face for a long, silent moment. He asked me directly if I felt any lingering paternal regret regarding the absolute severity of our counterattack. He wanted to know if the sight of my only son locked inside the back of a police cruiser had triggered any maternal hesitation. I set my crystal tumbler down onto the mahogany table with a solid, definitive thud. I looked my brilliant attorney directly in the eyes. I answered his question with absolute, unwavering honesty. I told him that protecting oneself from aggressive parasites requires an incredibly strong stomach. I explained that a man cannot build a lasting legacy if he allows a rotting, infected branch to poison the entire tree. I felt absolutely zero regret for dismantling their criminal enterprise. Jared had actively chosen to view my death as a convenient financial milestone. He had weaponized his own wife against my sanctuary. I did not act out of blind emotional vengeance. I acted precisely as a responsible father must act when his offspring embraces total moral bankruptcy. I held my child strictly and unapologetically accountable for his own malicious decisions. I removed the safety net he was actively trying to strangle me with. The cold emptiness in my chest was not sorrow. It was the absolute clarity of necessary survival. Mitchell nodded slowly, fully absorbing the cold, metallic truth of my response. He understood that my paternal sentimentality had been permanently surgically removed by Jared's own hand. He reached back into his leather briefcase and retrieved one final document. It was a single sheet of heavy white paper bearing the stark official seal of the federal courthouse. He slid the document across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my crystal tumbler. He informed me that the paper was an official court summons. Jared and Megan's joint emergency bail hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The federal judge would formally review the severe charges and determine their immediate physical fate. The prosecutor had explicitly requested my presence in the courtroom as the primary victim of the financial fraud. Mitchell stated that my physical appearance in the gallery would absolutely guarantee the judge denied any request for leniency or reduced bail. He took a final sip of his scotch and stood up from the dining table. He packed his empty briefcase and walked quietly toward the front door, leaving me alone with the court document. I stared at the bold black text detailing the time and location of my son's legal reckoning. The heavy silence of my empty house pressed in around me. I picked up the paper and read Jared's name printed under the heading of a criminal defendant. I had to make one final definitive choice. I had to decide if I would walk into that sterile federal courtroom tomorrow morning to personally twist the knife and watch the heavy metal bars slam shut, or simply stay home and let the unforgiving justice system devour him whole. The heavy brass handles of the federal courthouse doors felt cold against my palm as I pushed them open. The interior of the building was a monument to absolute institutional authority. Polished marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting, and towering granite columns projected an atmosphere of uncompromising justice. I bypassed the crowded central benches and walked deliberately toward the rear of the assigned courtroom. I selected a seat in the very back row, positioning myself in the deep shadows beneath the overhanging balcony. I did not come to offer moral support. I did not come to be a visible presence of familial solidarity. I came as a silent, detached observer to verify the mechanical execution of the law. The courtroom was filled with the low, anxious murmuring of defense attorneys and court clerks shuffling thick stacks of legal files. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden side door adjacent to the judge's bench swung open. The armed bailiff stepped through, followed immediately by my son. The physical transformation was staggering. The arrogant, impeccably groomed corporate executive who had stood on my front porch yesterday evening had been entirely erased. Jared shuffled into the sterile room wearing a standard-issue bright orange correctional jumpsuit. The coarse fabric hung loosely over his shrinking frame. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked rhythmically with every pathetic, defeated step he took. His face was a mask of sheer exhaustion and profound terror. His skin was pale and drawn, stripped of its artificial suburban glow. He looked entirely broken. The reality of a single night in a federal holding cell had crushed his fragile ego into absolute dust. He sank heavily into the wooden chair beside his court-appointed attorney, staring blankly at the polished table in front of him. The judge entered the room, his black robes billowing, and slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp, violent crack instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. The proceedings began with aggressive, desperate maneuvering from the defense tables. Megan's high-priced attorney stood up first. He launched into a highly choreographed, emotionally manipulative narrative designed to completely sever her from Jared's criminal enterprise. The lawyer gestured dramatically toward his client, painting a vivid picture of a terrified, financially abused woman. He argued forcefully that Jared ruled their household with a tyrannical iron fist. He claimed Megan was kept entirely in the dark regarding their true financial reality, forced to sign documents under severe emotional duress. He portrayed her as a tragic, innocent victim of a manipulative husband who systematically lied to her about his corporate bonuses and municipal contracts. Jared's attorney instantly scrambled to counter the betrayal. He recognized that the recorded audio confession and the flawless paper trail provided by Mitchell made a claim of innocence utterly impossible. Instead, he pivoted to a pathetic, humiliating defense of temporary insanity. He argued that the crushing, unprecedented macroeconomic pressures of the failing digital economy had completely fractured his client's mind. He claimed Jared was suffering from a severe stress-induced psychosis brought on by his collapsing crypto portfolio and impossible suburban debts. The judge did not interrupt their frantic theatrical performances. He sat high above the courtroom, adjusting his reading glasses as he methodically reviewed the thick, authenticated dossier Mitchell had personally delivered to the federal prosecutor. He examined the wire transfer logs proving the stolen funds went directly into Megan's private LLC. He read the transcript of the audio recording detailing their calculated conspiracy to lock me in a psychiatric ward. The undeniable, cold, hard evidence rendered every single word spoken by the defense attorneys entirely hollow. The judge lowered the heavy dossier and removed his glasses. He looked down at the defense tables with an expression of absolute stone-faced disdain. He cut through the legal theatrics with a voice that echoed like thunder against the granite walls. He addressed the severe, premeditated nature of the charges directly. He stated that first-degree bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud were not minor infractions born of economic stress. They were highly calculated predatory felonies. He explicitly referenced the audio recording, noting that it demonstrated a chilling level of ongoing criminal coordination rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. He dismantled Megan's defense by citing the direct routing of the stolen $150,000 into her sole proprietorship, proving her active and willing participation in the financial execution. The judge then addressed the issue of bail. He stated that the massive amount of stolen capital, coupled with their proven ability to forge highly complex legal documents, established a clear and undeniable flight risk. He declared that their demonstrated willingness to falsely institutionalize a family member to secure those funds proved they were an active, ongoing danger to the community. He struck his gavel against the wooden block with brutal finality. Bail was unequivocally denied for both defendants. He ordered them remanded immediately to federal custody. He set a rapid, aggressive trial date for the following month, effectively locking them inside their concrete cells without a single avenue for escape or negotiation. The hammer of justice had fallen exactly as I had engineered. The sharp crack of this gavel signaled the absolute end of their former lives. The two armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, placing their heavy hands firmly on Jared and Megan's shoulders. They ordered the defendants to stand and prepare for transport back to the federal holding facility. Megan began to openly weep, her shoulders shaking violently as the guard physically directed her toward the side door. Jared rose slowly from his chair. The heavy steel chains around his ankles rattled loudly against the quiet courtroom floor. As the bailiff turned him toward the exit, Jared's head snapped up. He ignored the guard's instructions and began to frantically scan the crowded gallery. His bloodshot, terrified eyes swept desperately across the rows of wooden benches. He was searching the faces of strangers, hunting for a single familiar lifeline. He was looking for my eyes. He was searching for the father he had actively attempted to destroy, hoping to find a lingering shred of pity, a final ounce of unconditional salvation to pull him from the wreckage of his own greed. He tasted the absolute suffocating terror of total isolation. I did not wait for his frantic gaze to reach the shadows of the back row. I did not allow him the momentary comfort of making eye contact. The exact second he turned his head toward the gallery, I stood up from the wooden bench in a single smooth motion. I turned my back entirely on the courtroom and walked deliberately toward the exit. I pushed the heavy double doors open and stepped out into the bright, blinding morning sun. I did not look back. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, sealing my former son inside his self-constructed prison. The severance was absolute. The heavy gavel fell 3 months ago, but its final echo had just faded from my mind. The criminal trial was swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of suspense. The overwhelming mountain of evidence Mitchell prepared dismantled every pathetic defense Jared and Megan attempted to mount. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before delivering guilty verdicts on all counts: aggravated identity theft, first-degree bank fraud, conspiracy. The judge handed down severe mandatory sentences, ensuring they would spend the next several years in separate penitentiaries. I did not attend the formal sentencing hearing. I did not need to see the final act of their self-destruction. I simply received the brief phone call from Mitchell confirming the outcome and turned my mobile phone completely off. Now I sat alone in my favorite leather armchair in the center of my quiet living room. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the large bay windows, casting warm golden geometric patterns across the pristine hardwood floor. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had poisoned the air in this house for 3 grueling years was entirely eradicated. The profound silence was no longer heavy or threatening. It was deeply restorative. I breathed in the clean, still air and felt my broad shoulders drop. The house finally felt like a personal sanctuary again. The lingering scent of Megan's overpowering floral perfume had been professionally scrubbed from the ventilation system. The constant grating sound of Jared's entitled complaints no longer echoed off the plaster walls. I had successfully excised the parasitic infection that had taken root in my home. I closed my eyes and allowed the absolute peace of the moment to wash over me. The battle was definitively over, and I remained the undisputed master of my own domain. But the physical spaces they had occupied still held the visual residue of their greed. The guest suite they had aggressively commandeered felt like a highly contaminated zone. Megan had painted the walls a sterile, cold gray and filled the space with ostentatious, impractical modern furniture purchased entirely with my stolen money. I refused to let that aesthetic violation stand for another day. I contacted a premium residential contracting firm the very next morning. I hired a massive crew of skilled craftsmen and instructed them to completely gut the entire wing of the house. I demanded they rip up the imported carpets and tear down the custom shelving units Jared had installed to display his worthless golf trophies. I watched with profound satisfaction as the demolition team hauled heavy bags of debris out to a massive steel dumpster parked in the driveway. The physical labor of tearing down their legacy was incredibly cathartic. Once the rooms were stripped down to the bare wooden studs, I directed the comprehensive reconstruction. I was reclaiming the exact architectural vision Evelyn and I had originally drafted over 40 years ago. I ordered the installation of rich, warm mahogany paneling and classic crown molding. I converted Megan's absurd dressing room into a beautiful sunlit reading library featuring floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I transformed Jared's former office space into an expansive drafting room complete with wide architect desks and premium drafting tools. I methodically erased every single physical footprint they had left behind. The house was no longer a monument to their arrogant entitlement. It was reborn as a pristine tribute to the enduring love and shared dreams that Evelyn and I had meticulously built together. I stood in the doorway of the newly finished library, breathing in the fresh scent of polished wood. The physical restoration of the house was merely the first phase of my personal reclamation. The vast, untouched capital resting securely in my offshore accounts required a definitive, highly meaningful purpose. I refused to let those resources sit idle, and I absolutely refused to leave them to a bloodline that had so thoroughly betrayed me. I scheduled a lengthy, strategic meeting with Mitchell and a team of top-tier philanthropic advisors. I directed a massive injection of liquid capital to establish a permanent, fully funded educational endowment. I created a comprehensive collegiate engineering scholarship specifically designed to identify, support, and elevate brilliant, underprivileged Black students. I named the foundation the Evelyn Memorial Engineering Trust. Evelyn had always been a fierce advocate for education and a relentless champion for the marginalized youth in our original community. This endowment was the ultimate manifestation of her beautiful, enduring spirit. The trust provided full tuition premium housing and guaranteed professional internships for dozens of young minds who possessed the raw talent but lacked the financial machinery to succeed. I spent my mornings reviewing incredible application essays from ambitious young men and women who possessed the exact fire and determination I had carried in my own youth. I was redirecting the wealth Jared had desperately tried to steal toward individuals who would actually utilize it to build magnificent things. I was actively constructing a living, breathing legacy that pure greed could never touch, corrupt, or dismantle. The profound joy of reading a passionate acceptance letter from a young, aspiring architect dwarfed any fleeting satisfaction I might have felt from watching my son go to prison. I was no longer defined by his criminal betrayal. I was defined by the phenomenal futures I was actively helping to engineer. My new daily routine settled into a flawless, highly productive rhythm. I spent my afternoons drafting new philanthropic initiatives and my evenings reading quietly in the freshly renovated library. The dark, chaotic chapters of the past felt increasingly distant, completely replaced by a profound, unshakable serenity. I walked out to the heavy iron mailbox at the end of the driveway on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. The suburban street was completely silent, free of the flashing police cruisers and moving trucks that had defined the climax of our conflict. I retrieved a small stack of mundane correspondence. There were glossy catalogs, utility bills, and a thick legal envelope from Mitchell containing the latest quarterly financial projections for the scholarship fund. I sifted through the innocuous pile as I walked back up the pristine concrete driveway. Hidden squarely in the center of the stack was a stark standard-issue white envelope. It possessed no glossy branding or typed professional labels. I stopped walking and stared at the top left corner of the coarse paper. The bold stamped ink clearly displayed the official return address of the state penitentiary. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. I simply felt the cold weight of the past attempting to tap on the glass of my new reality. I looked down at the center of the envelope. The destination address was meticulously handwritten in dark blue ink. I recognized the sharp, precise curvature of the letters instantly. It was the exact same deliberate handwriting Jared had spent weeks practicing to forge my name on those fraudulent bank documents. The physical evidence of his desperate, crushing isolation rested quietly in the palm of my hand. I stood completely still on the driveway, holding the sealed letter. I stood completely still on the sunlit concrete of my driveway. The coarse paper of the envelope rested against my fingertips. I stared at the jagged blue ink detailing my name and address. I knew exactly what words were contained inside that sealed enclosure. I knew Jared would deploy desperate apologies and manufactured remorse. He would try to invoke the sacred bond of father and son. He would construct a pathetic narrative, framing himself as a reformed man who simply needed one final chance. I did not need to read the words to understand the manipulation. My thumb traced the edge of the paper for a single fleeting second. I felt absolutely no curiosity. I felt no obligation to engage with a convicted felon who had systematically attempted to destroy my entire existence. I lowered my hand to my side. I turned away from the heavy iron mailbox and walked with measured, deliberate steps back toward my front door. The morning air was crisp and incredibly clear. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my foyer. I did not pause to set the rest of the mail on the hallway table. I walked directly into the pristine, updated kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the recessed ceiling lights. I approached the heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sitting discreetly beside the granite counter. I did not hesitate. I did not afford the letter a final, lingering glance. I fed the unopened envelope straight into the narrow mechanical slot. The sharp steel blades engaged instantly with a loud, aggressive whine. The machine violently consumed the paper. It shredded Jared's desperate apologies into thousands of meaningless, unreadable white ribbons. The mechanical noise stopped, and the kitchen returned to absolute perfect silence. The physical destruction of that letter represented the final, absolute severance of my past. The toxic influence that had deeply infected my life for 3 agonizing years was entirely eradicated. Jared and Megan possessed absolutely zero power over my present reality. They were confined to concrete cells, paying the strict mandatory price for their unforgiving greed. My fortified home was a completely secure fortress. The heavy biometric locks and the advanced security systems formed an impenetrable barrier against any future incursions. But my true security extended far beyond the reinforced doors and the newly installed mahogany panels. The Evelyn Memorial Engineering Trust stood as an indestructible financial and legal shield. My massive offshore assets were permanently locked within the ironclad parameters of the philanthropic endowment. Mitchell had constructed the legal framework with ruthless precision. The money was actively funding the brilliant futures of underprivileged scholars and could never be touched by greedy hands. No distant relative or ambitious predator could ever challenge the airtight legal structure we had built. I stood in the center of my flawless kitchen and felt the profound gravity of absolute control. I governed every single aspect of my daily existence. I dictated the flow of my wealth and the boundaries of my peace. I was no longer a vulnerable target waiting to be exploited by arrogant youth. I was the undisputed architect of my own destiny. The persistent anxiety that had once clouded my vision was permanently banished. I possessed the extraordinary luxury of waking up every single morning with total sovereign authority over my time, my resources, and my legacy. The shadows of betrayal were completely banished by the bright, blinding light of my reclaimed independence. I turned my attention away from the silent shredder and faced the gleaming gas stove. I reached forward and twisted the heavy steel knob. The blue flame ignited instantly with a soft, rhythmic hiss. I placed my polished copper kettle over the heat and watched the bright fire lick the metallic base. I moved toward the pantry and retrieved a sealed bag of premium dark roast coffee beans. I measured the dark, oily beans with exact precision and poured them into the electric burr grinder. I pressed the activation switch and the loud mechanical grinding instantly filled the kitchen. The rich, complex aroma of toasted coffee heavily saturated the clean morning air. It was a comforting sensory ritual that grounded me entirely in the present moment. The kettle began to emit a steady, high-pitched whistle signaling the boiling water. I turned off the gas flame and walked deliberately toward the upper wooden cabinets. I opened the solid oak door and reached inside. I completely bypassed the old chipped porcelain cups we had used for decades. I bypassed the generic glassware Megan had arrogantly purchased during her occupation. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a brand new handcrafted ceramic mug. It was a stunning piece of artisanal pottery. The clay was thick, heavy, and glazed in a deep midnight blue. The surface was slightly textured, bearing the unique, subtle marks of the potter who had shaped it by hand. It was beautiful. It was unyielding. It was entirely and exclusively mine. The mug possessed a profound physical weight that felt perfectly balanced in my grip. I set the heavy ceramic down onto the cool granite countertop. I poured the freshly ground dark roast into the French press and slowly added the boiling water. The deep brown liquid bloomed instantly, releasing an incredibly rich, fragrant cloud of steam. I depressed the heavy metal plunger with a slow, steady motion, filtering the dark liquid. I lifted the glass carafe and poured the steaming coffee directly into my new midnight blue ceramic mug. The dark liquid filled the heavy cup, warming the thick clay against my palms. I picked up the mug and walked slowly out of the kitchen. I moved into the adjacent formal living room where the morning sunlight was currently streaming through the large bay windows. I stopped directly in front of the stone fireplace mantel. I looked up at the beautifully framed portrait of my late wife, Evelyn. Her bright, intelligent eyes smiled back at me from the canvas. Her expression radiated the same fierce, unwavering strength she had possessed in life. I looked at her beautiful face and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I spoke to her in the quiet, sunlit room. I told her that I did not let them break the foundation we had sacrificed everything to build. I told her that our legacy remained completely intact and actively thriving in the world. I understood now with crystalline clarity that survival often demands brutal, difficult choices. Sometimes taking a sharp axe to a rotting, infected branch is the only possible way to ensure the entire tree survives and continues to grow. I raised the heavy ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, slow sip. The dark roast was incredibly smooth and rich with absolutely zero bitterness. It was without question the best cup of coffee I have ever tasted. How would you protect your hard-earned assets if your own family turned against your legacy? Share your thoughts and tell me which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you value these stories of absolute justice and strategic triumph, please support the channel by clicking the thumbs up button and subscribing for more completed scripts. You can also send a super thanks to directly fund our upcoming narrative projects. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss the next dramatic presentation. Thank you deeply for your continued loyalty and respect.